Millionaire marries 18-year-old beggar. But what she reveals at the altar is shocking. Before we begin this emotional journey, we'd love to hear from you. Comment your city below and let us know where you're tuning in from. Sit back and enjoy the story. You're in for something unforgettable. The first snowflakes of the season fell gently on the bustling streets of New York City. The evening rush blurred into a flurry of glowing headlights, hurried footsteps, and misty breaths clouding the cold air. At the corner of West 34th Street, tucked between a boarded-up shop and a graffiti-covered wall, Evelyn Grace sat on a pile of worn blankets, clutching her knees to her chest. Her small, delicate hands trembled from the cold, but her wide hazel eyes remained fixed on the glamorous world that passed her by, an endless parade of warm coats, leather boots, and shopping bags filled with gifts she could only dream of. Evelyn was only 8 years old, but her eyes carried the weight of someone who had lived a lifetime of hardship. Beside her, her mother, Margaret, was curled up, coughing softly into a thin scarf that provided little protection against the biting cold. The sound of her mother's weak breathing had become a constant reminder to Evelyn. Time was running out. As the night deepened, Evelyn's hunger gnawed at her stomach, but it wasn't the hunger that hurt the most. It was the fear of waking up one day and finding her mother gone. "Evelyn," Margaret whispered, her voice barely audible. "You need to rest, my love." "I'm fine." "Mama," Evelyn replied, wrapping her arm around her mother's shoulders. She wasn't fine, but she had learned to lie to protect her mother's heart. Suddenly, a sleek black limousine pulled up to the curb in front of an upscale restaurant. Evelyn's gaze shifted. Her curiosity piqued as she watched a tall man in a tailored coat step out. The streetlight cast a golden glow on him, highlighting his chiseled jawline and the neatly combed dark hair that framed his stern face. His name was Nathaniel West, but to Evelyn, he looked like something out of the fairy tales her mother used to read to her before the world turned so cruel. Nathaniel paused on the sidewalk, adjusting the lapel of his coat as he checked his phone. Even from a distance, Evelyn could sense the cold detachment in his posture, the way he carried himself as if nothing could touch him. A man like that didn't worry about where his next meal would come from. He didn't sleep on the streets or beg strangers for spare change. Evelyn's heart raced as an idea began to form, wild and desperate. It was ridiculous, impossible, but she had no choice. She couldn't let her mother die. Before she could second-guess herself, Evelyn jumped to her feet and ran toward Nathaniel, weaving through the crowd with determination. Her worn sneakers barely made a sound on the pavement, but her small voice pierced through the noise of the city. "Excuse me, sir. Please wait." Nathaniel stopped mid-step, frowning as he turned to see the girl approaching. Her thin frame was wrapped in a tattered coat several sizes too big, and her face was pale from the cold. For a moment, he thought she was just another beggar, but something in her eyes made him pause. There was a fire there, a spark of courage that he hadn't seen in a long time. "What is it?" he asked, his tone more impatient than he intended. Evelyn took a deep breath, clutching the hem of her coat as she stared up at him. "Will you marry me?" The words hung in the air. Absurd and fragile, like glass teetering on the edge of a table. For a second, Nathaniel didn't respond. He thought he had misheard her. "Marry you," he repeated, his voice laced with disbelief. "What kind of joke is this?" "It's not a joke," Evelyn said firmly. Her eyes glistened, but she held back her tears. "I need you to marry me, just for one day. If you do, I'll be your princess and you'll be my prince. And you can help my mom. She's sick, and we don't have any money." Nathaniel's jaw tightened. He had encountered desperate people before, people who begged, lied, and manipulated to get what they wanted. But this was different. This girl wasn't begging. She was making a deal, and the conviction in her voice made him uneasy. He glanced past her and saw Margaret sitting on the sidewalk, coughing into her hands. Her hollow cheeks and sunken eyes told a story of suffering that didn't need words. Nathaniel looked away quickly, as if the sight of their reality was too much to bear. "I'm sorry," he said, stepping back. "I can't help you." Evelyn's small hand shot out, grabbing the sleeve of his coat. "Please," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Just listen, my mom is all I have. If you help her, I promise I won't bother you ever again." Something in her plea pierced through Nathaniel's defenses. He wasn't sure if it was the desperation in her voice or the haunting resemblance she had to someone he once knew, a memory he had tried to bury deep within him. He sighed, running a hand through his hair as he tried to shake off the unease creeping into his chest. "This is crazy," he muttered to himself. But before he could walk away, his phone buzzed with a message from his assistant. "The dinner meeting is postponed." Nathaniel exhaled slowly, his breath visible in the cold night air. Against his better judgment, he crouched down to Evelyn's level, meeting her gaze. "If I agree to listen," he said carefully, "you have to tell me everything, no lies." Evelyn nodded, her heart pounding with a mixture of hope and fear. "Okay, I promise." Nathaniel stood up and offered his hand. "Come on then. Let's get you and your mother out of the cold." Evelyn's fingers wrapped around his. And for the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, there was still a little magic left in the world. In the back of the limousine, Evelyn sat with her mother, who had fallen asleep against her shoulder. Nathaniel watched them in silence, his mind racing with questions. He didn't know why he had agreed to this. Perhaps it was guilt, or maybe it was because deep down he saw a part of himself in Evelyn, lost, desperate, and clinging to hope. As the car sped through the streets of Manhattan, Nathaniel's phone buzzed again. This time it was a message from David Hawthorne, his longtime friend and lawyer. "We need to talk. Urgent." Nathaniel frowned, but he ignored the message for now. Whatever David had to say could wait. He had just made a decision that would change all their lives forever, and there was no turning back. The warmth of the limousine was a welcome change from the biting cold outside. Evelyn sat quietly, her small fingers entwined with her mother's as Margaret slept with her head resting against Evelyn's shoulder. The rhythmic hum of the engine provided a strange sense of calm, but Evelyn's heart was still racing. She had done it. She had convinced a stranger, no, a prince as she saw it, to help her mother. Nathaniel West sat across from them, leaning back in his seat with one hand resting under his chin. His gaze flickered between the sleeping woman and the little girl who had just turned his evening upside down. The silence was suffocating, but his mind was anything but still. "How old are you?" "Evelyn?" His voice was softer now, stripped of the impatience he'd shown earlier. "8, she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "But Mama says I'm almost 9. Nathaniel smiled faintly at her attempt to sound older. "Do you live on the streets?" Evelyn hesitated, as if admitting it would make their situation more real than it already was. "Not always. We had a small apartment before Mama got sick, but she couldn't go to work anymore, so we couldn't pay the rent. They made us leave." Nathaniel's jaw tightened as he listened. He had grown up in the system, bouncing from foster home to foster home after the death of his parents. He knew what it was like to feel helpless, to have no one to turn to. But hearing Evelyn's story stirred something deeper, something he hadn't felt in years. "How long has your mom been sick?" Evelyn bit her lip. "A few months. At first it was just a cough, but then it got worse, and now she can't even walk much without getting tired." Nathaniel's gaze softened as he took in the sight of Margaret, her breathing shallow and labored even in sleep. He wanted to believe that this was just another sad story he could walk away from once his conscience was clear. But deep down, he knew better. He wasn't the kind of man who could ignore this, at least not anymore. The limousine pulled into the circular driveway of a luxurious hotel, its golden lights casting a warm glow over the snowy landscape. Evelyn's eyes widened as she peered out the window. She had never seen anything so grand in her life. "Where are we?" she asked, her voice trembling with awe. "A hotel," Nathaniel replied. "You and your mother will stay here tonight. I'll arrange for a doctor to come see her." "A doctor?" Evelyn's eyes filled with tears of relief. "Really? You mean it?" "Yes," Nathaniel said firmly. "But first, we need to get you both inside and warm." The hotel staff greeted Nathaniel with the kind of deference reserved for royalty, but Evelyn barely noticed. She was too busy marveling at the sparkling chandeliers, the marble floors, and the grand staircase that curved upward like something out of a fairy tale. Nathaniel guided them to a private suite on the top floor, where a fire crackled in the fireplace, casting a cozy glow over the elegant furnishings. A plush king-sized bed sat in the center of the room, piled high with soft pillows and blankets that looked like clouds. Evelyn helped her mother settle into the bed, tucking the blankets around her frail body. Margaret stirred briefly, murmuring Evelyn's name before drifting back into unconsciousness. Evelyn sat beside her, brushing a strand of hair from her mother's face. Nathaniel stood by the window, watching the snow fall against the backdrop of the city skyline. His phone vibrated again, but this time, he didn't ignore it. "David," he said, answering the call. "I've been trying to reach you all night." David's voice crackled through the line. A mix of concern and frustration. "What's going on?" Nathaniel glanced over at Evelyn, who was now curled up next to her mother. "I met someone tonight. A little girl named Evelyn Grace. She and her mother are homeless, and the mother's sick. I'm helping them." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Helping them how?" Nathaniel sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "I don't know yet, but I couldn't just leave them there, David. Not after seeing them like that." David's voice softened. "Nate, you have a big heart. I know that. But you also have a lot to lose. Be careful." "I will." Nathaniel ended the call and slipped his phone back into his pocket. He wasn't sure what he was doing, but for the first time in a long time, it didn't matter. The doctor arrived within the hour, a middle-aged man with kind eyes and a gentle demeanor. He examined Margaret carefully while Evelyn watched anxiously from the foot of the bed. Nathaniel stood by the door, our arms crossed, his expression unreadable. After what felt like an eternity, the doctor approached Nathaniel. "Her condition is serious. Pneumonia, compounded by severe malnutrition and exhaustion. She'll need immediate treatment and proper nutrition if she's going to recover." Nathaniel nodded. "Do whatever you have to do." "I'll cover the costs." The doctor hesitated. "She needs rest, but there's something else." He lowered his voice. "Her body is weak. If she doesn't respond to treatment soon, she may not have much time left." Nathaniel's chest tightened. He glanced over at Evelyn, who was now stroking her mother's hand, whispering words of comfort. The weight of responsibility pressed down on him, heavier than anything he had ever carried. When the doctor left, Nathaniel walked over to Evelyn and knelt beside her. "Your mom is going to get the help she needs," he said softly. "But you have to be strong for her. Okay?" Evelyn looked up at him, her eyes brimming with tears. "I will." Nathaniel hesitated, then gently placed a hand on her shoulder. "Why did you ask me to marry you?" Evelyn smiled through her tears. "Because princes always save princesses in the stories, and I needed someone to save us." Nathaniel swallowed hard, her words cutting through him like a knife. She didn't know that he wasn't a prince, that he was a man with a past so dark it could swallow them both whole. But in that moment, he wished he could be the prince she believed he was. As the fire crackled in the background, Nathaniel made a silent promise. He didn't know where this journey would lead, but he would do everything in his power to protect her, even if it meant confronting the demons he had spent his life running from. For the first time in years, Nathaniel felt something stir within him, something he thought he had lost forever: hope. The morning light crept through the heavy curtains, casting a soft glow across the hotel suite. Evelyn stirred on the armchair where she had fallen asleep, still wrapped in one of the hotel's plush blankets. She opened her eyes slowly and glanced toward the bed where her mother was resting. Margaret's breathing seemed steadier now, though her face was still pale and drawn. Evelyn stretched, her small body still aching from days of sleeping on cold sidewalks. But for the first time in weeks, she wasn't cold, and that alone felt like a miracle. Nathaniel was standing by the window, dressed in a crisp white shirt and tailored slacks, a cup of coffee in hand. He didn't look like the kind of man who spent nights tossing and turning over decisions. But last night, after Evelyn and her mother had fallen asleep, he had barely closed his eyes. "Good morning," Nathaniel said when he noticed her stirring. "Morning," Evelyn replied softly, rubbing her eyes. She hesitated before asking, "Did the doctor come back?" "He'll be back this afternoon," Nathaniel replied, setting his coffee cup on the table. "Your mom needs rest, but she's stable for now." Evelyn let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Stable. It wasn't much, but it was enough to give her hope. Nathaniel walked over and sat down on the sofa across from her, his gaze steady but kind. "We need to talk." "Evelyn." She sat up straighter, clutching the edge of the blanket. "Did I do something wrong?" "No," he said quickly. "You didn't do anything wrong. But I need to understand something." His tone shifted, becoming softer. "Why did you really ask me to marry you?" Evelyn bit her lip, her small fingers fidgeting with the blanket. "Because I knew you could help us. I saw you get out of that fancy car and you looked important, like someone who could fix things." She looked down at her lap. "Mama always says fairy tales aren't real, but I thought, maybe, just this once they could be." Nathaniel leaned back, his gaze never leaving her. He had spent years building walls around himself, but something about this little girl was slowly chipping away at them. "I'm not a prince, Evelyn," he said quietly. "I'm just a man." "You don't have to be a real prince," she whispered. "You just have to care." The simplicity of her words struck him like a blow to the chest. She didn't want his money or his status. She just wanted someone to care. Nathaniel exhaled slowly, rubbing his temples as he tried to process what he was about to do. This wasn't part of the plan. He didn't make decisions based on emotions. But here he was, about to make a deal that could change everything. "Okay," he said finally, his voice steady. "Here's what we're going to do. I'll take care of your mom's medical bills. I'll make sure she gets the best treatment possible." Evelyn's eyes widened with hope. "Really?" "Yes," Nathaniel confirmed. "But there's a condition." Evelyn's hope dimmed slightly, but she nodded. "What is it?" "We'll have the wedding," he said, leaning forward. "A small, symbolic ceremony. Just you, your mom, and a few people I trust. It won't be real, but it'll be enough to make you feel like a princess for a day." He paused, studying her reaction. "But after that, I need you to trust me. No more running around asking strangers for help. I'll take care of things from here." Evelyn considered his words carefully. She didn't understand everything, but she understood enough. This was her chance to save her mother, and she wasn't going to let it slip away. "I promise," she said, her voice firm. "I won't bother anyone else, just help Mama." Nathaniel nodded, satisfied with her response. "Good. Now let's get you some breakfast." The dining room of the hotel was filled with the smell of freshly baked pastries, sizzling bacon, and brewed coffee. Evelyn's eyes widened at the sight of the buffet, her mouth watering as she took in the spread of food. Nathaniel handed her a plate, and she hesitated for only a moment before piling it high with pancakes, sausages, and fruit. He couldn't help but smile as he watched her eat with the kind of enthusiasm only a child could muster. It reminded him of simpler times, before life had twisted and hardened him into the man he had become. As Evelyn finished her second helping, Nathaniel's phone buzzed on the table. He glanced at the screen and saw David's name flashing. Reluctantly, he answered. "Are you at the office yet?" David asked without preamble. "No," Nathaniel replied. "I'm still with Evelyn and her mother." There was a pause before David sighed heavily. "Nate, I know you want to help them, but you need to be careful. You're already in deep. If anyone finds out—" "I know," Nathaniel interrupted, his tone sharp. "I'm handling it." David lowered his voice. "You always think you can handle everything alone. But this isn't just about you anymore. These people, this girl, you've brought them into your life. What if your past catches up to you?" Nathaniel clenched his jaw, his grip tightening on the phone. "It won't." "How can you be so sure?" Because he had spent years making sure of it. Every loose end, every threat, he had tied them up with precision. But David was right about one thing. Evelyn and her mother had changed the equation. "I'll call you later," Nathaniel said, ending the call before David could press further. When he turned back to the table, Evelyn was watching him, her fork halfway to her mouth. "Are you okay, Mr. West?" Nathaniel forced a smile. "I'm fine, Evelyn, and you can call me Nate." "Okay, Nate," she said, returning his smile. "Thank you for breakfast." "You're welcome." He hesitated before adding, "And thank you for trusting me." Evelyn tilted her head as if the concept of trust was foreign to her. But she nodded anyway. "You seem like someone I can trust." Nathaniel's chest tightened at her words. If only she knew the truth. Later that afternoon, the doctor returned to check on Margaret. Her condition had improved slightly, but she still had a long road ahead. Nathaniel made arrangements for her to be transferred to a private clinic where she could receive round-the-clock care. As they prepared to leave the hotel, Evelyn held Nathaniel's hand tightly, her small fingers clinging to his like a lifeline. "Where are we going now?" she asked, her voice filled with both hope and fear. "To the clinic," Nathaniel replied. "Your mom will be taken care of there." "And after that?" Nathaniel looked down at her, the weight of her question pressing heavily on him. "We take it one step at a time, Evelyn, but I promise you this, you're not alone anymore." Evelyn's grip on his hand tightened. She didn't say anything, but her silence spoke volumes. She was trusting him to keep that promise, and for the first time in years, Nathaniel wasn't sure if he was ready for the responsibility, but he had already taken the first step, and there was no turning back now. As the car pulled away from the hotel, snowflakes danced against the windows, and Nathaniel stared out at the city that had once been his battlefield. He had spent years fighting for control. But something about Evelyn and her mother was unraveling that control piece by piece. And somewhere, deep down, he knew that this wasn't just about saving them. It was about saving himself. The clinic was nothing like the cold, impersonal hospitals Evelyn had grown used to seeing. The walls were painted in soft pastels, and the air smelled of lavender instead of disinfectant. Margaret had been given a private room with large windows that let in the soft afternoon light. She lay peacefully in bed, her breathing steadier thanks to the oxygen mask gently resting over her nose. Evelyn sat by her mother's side, holding her hand while a nurse adjusted the IV attached to her arm. Her mother's face, though still pale, had regained a touch of color. It wasn't much, but to Evelyn it was a sign of hope. Nathaniel stood by the door, watching silently. The sight of the little girl caring so attentively for her mother stirred something inside him, something he wasn't ready to confront. He knew what it was, but acknowledging it meant opening a part of himself he had buried long ago. Evelyn looked up and met his gaze. Is she going to get better now? Nathaniel walked over and crouched down beside her. The doctors are going to do everything they can, but she needs rest and time. Evelyn nodded, but her eyes betrayed her fear. She's really tired all the time. Her voice wavered. Sometimes I think she's too tired to keep fighting. Nathaniel gently placed a hand on her shoulder. She's stronger than you think. And you're strong too, Evelyn. I don't feel strong, she whispered. I feel scared. Nathaniel hesitated, then sat on the floor beside her. I used to feel scared too, he admitted, his voice low. When I was a kid, I lost my parents. After that, I was scared all the time. I didn't know where I'd live or who would take care of me. Evelyn's eyes widened. You didn't have a mom or dad either? No, Nathaniel said softly. But I learned that sometimes being scared doesn't mean you're not strong. It just means you care enough to be afraid. Evelyn leaned into him, resting her head on his shoulder. It was a small gesture, but it sent a wave of warmth through Nathaniel's chest. You're strong, Evelyn, he repeated as if saying it could make her believe it. You're the bravest person I've met. For a moment, they sat in comfortable silence, the only sound being the steady hum of the machines monitoring Margaret's vitals. But Nathaniel's peace was short-lived. His phone vibrated in his pocket, and when he checked the screen, his heart sank. David Hawthorne. Nathaniel stood up, excusing himself from the room. He walked down the corridor until he found a quiet corner near a row of large windows overlooking the city. Snowflakes drifted lazily past the glass, but his mind was anything but calm. He answered the call, his voice tense. "What now, David?" "You tell me," David replied sharply. "I did some digging on Margaret Grace. You're not going to like what I found." Nathaniel's grip on the phone tightened. "What do you mean?" "There's a connection," David said, lowering his voice. "Margaret wasn't just some random woman you stumbled across. She worked as a housekeeper for the West family, your family, right before the fire." Nathaniel's breath hitched. "What?" "She was there, Nate. The night your parents died." The weight of David's words hit him like a punch to the gut. Memories he had spent years trying to forget came rushing back. The smell of smoke, the sound of crackling flames, and the panic as he was pulled from the burning house. He had always thought the fire was an accident, an electrical fault, or a cruel twist of fate. But now, a new possibility was creeping into his mind. "Are you saying she had something to do with the fire?" Nathaniel asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know," David admitted, "but it's too much of a coincidence to ignore. If I were you, I'd keep her close and find out the truth." Nathaniel's stomach churned. He had taken Evelyn and her mother into his life, opened doors he had sworn would stay closed forever. And now, he was standing on the edge of a cliff, staring down into the darkness of his past. "I need time," Nathaniel said, ending the call abruptly. He leaned against the window, pressing his forehead against the cool glass. His reflection stared back at him, but it wasn't the man he had worked so hard to become. It was the scared, lost boy he had buried deep inside. He couldn't let this break him. Not now. Not when Evelyn was counting on him. But the seed of doubt had been planted, and he couldn't shake the feeling that Margaret Grace knew more than she was letting on. When Nathaniel returned to the room, Evelyn was drawing on a piece of paper she had found in the drawer of the nightstand. Her tongue peeked out slightly as she concentrated, and for a moment, she looked like any other child, free from the worries of the world. He approached quietly, peering over her shoulder. "What are you drawing?" "A castle," Evelyn said proudly, holding up the picture. "It's where the princess lives with the prince." She hesitated, then added, "Maybe we can live in a castle one day. You, me, and Mama." Nathaniel forced a smile, but his heart ached. He didn't deserve to be her prince. Not with the storm brewing inside him, but he couldn't bring himself to shatter her dream. Not yet. "That's a good dream," he said, patting her head gently. "Do you have dreams, Nate?" she asked, tilting her head curiously. He looked out the window, his gaze distant. "I used to." "What happened to them?" "They got lost along the way." Evelyn frowned, as if she couldn't understand how someone could lose something as important as a dream. "Maybe you can find them again." Nathaniel's throat tightened. "Maybe," he said softly. As the evening wore on, Nathaniel sat by Margaret's bedside while Evelyn curled up on the sofa and drifted off to sleep. The room was quiet, save for the steady beeping of the monitors. Nathaniel watched Margaret's chest rise and fall, each breath a fragile reminder of how close she was to the edge. He couldn't afford to make a mistake. If Margaret was hiding something about that night, he had to know. But there was only one way to get the answers he needed, by staying close. As he leaned back in the chair, his phone buzzed again, but this time he didn't answer. He was too tired to face more questions, more doubts. Instead, he closed his eyes, letting the exhaustion wash over him. But even in sleep, the ghosts of his past refused to let him rest. The sound of rain tapping against the clinic's windows woke Nathaniel before dawn. He blinked groggily, momentarily disoriented as he glanced around the dimly lit room. Evelyn was curled up on the sofa, clutching a pillow to her chest, while Margaret lay motionless in bed, her breathing slow but steady. Nathaniel stretched, the stiffness in his neck a painful reminder that he had fallen asleep in the chair beside Margaret. He had barely closed his eyes before nightmares pulled him into the past. Smoke-filled rooms, panicked screams, and the overwhelming helplessness of that night. He rubbed his face, trying to shake off the lingering dread. Today, he would get answers. He had to. The door creaked open and a nurse entered quietly. Carrying a tray with medication, Nathaniel watched as she checked Margaret's vitals, her expression calm and professional. "She's doing better," the nurse whispered with a reassuring smile. "The antibiotics are working." Nathaniel nodded, relief momentarily washing over him, but as soon as the nurse left, the weight of his unresolved questions came crashing back down. He stood and walked to the window, staring out at the rain-soaked streets of New York. His mind raced, replaying David's words from the night before. "She worked for your family. She was there the night of the fire." Nathaniel clenched his fists. If Margaret knew something, anything about that night, he needed her to tell him. Behind him, a small voice broke the silence. "Are you okay, Nate?" He turned to see Evelyn sitting up on the sofa, rubbing her eyes. Her hair was messy, and her face was still puffy from sleep, but her concern for him was evident. "I'm fine," he lied. "Did you sleep well?" She nodded and slid off the sofa, padding over to him in her bare feet. "Mama always says that when people say they're fine, they're usually not." Nathaniel chuckled softly despite himself. "Your mom's a smart woman." Evelyn tilted her head, studying him. "Are you worried about Mama?" "Yes," he admitted, "but I'm also worried about something else." Evelyn's brow furrowed. "What is it?" Nathaniel hesitated. He couldn't tell her the truth. Not yet. "Just work stuff," he said, forcing a smile. "But it's nothing for you to worry about." Evelyn didn't look convinced. But she didn't press him further. Instead, she took his hand and led him back to the bed where Margaret lay. "Mama always feels better when you're here," she said. "Maybe if you stay, she'll wake up and talk to you." Nathaniel sat down again, his gaze softening as he watched Evelyn climb into the bed and curl up next to her mother. Margaret stirred slightly, her fingers twitching as if she sensed her daughter's presence. Nathaniel's phone buzzed in his pocket, breaking the moment. He pulled it out and saw a message from David. "We need to talk. Now." With a sigh, Nathaniel stood and quietly left the room, stepping into the empty corridor. He dialed David's number and leaned against the wall as he waited for him to answer. "Finally," David said, his tone impatient. "I was starting to think you were avoiding me." "I'm not avoiding you," Nathaniel replied. "I'm just trying to figure things out." "Well, let me help you figure it out faster," David said. "I did some more digging on Margaret Grace. It turns out she wasn't just a housekeeper. She was close to your mother." Nathaniel's pulse quickened. "Close how?" "Your mother trusted her. Margaret helped take care of you when you were a baby. I found letters your mother wrote to her, thanking her for staying late when she had business meetings and for being there during some of the toughest times." Nathaniel's breath hitched. "Why didn't I remember her?" "You were young, and after the fire you probably blocked out a lot of things," David explained. "But here's the kicker. One of those letters was dated a week before the fire. Your mother mentioned that she suspected something wasn't right with your uncles. She asked Margaret to watch over you if anything ever happened." Nathaniel's mind reeled. His mother had known something was wrong. She had trusted Margaret to protect him. But if Margaret had known about the danger, why hadn't she stopped it? "Does Margaret know about the letters?" he asked, his voice tight. "I don't know," David admitted. "But you need to ask her, and Nate, be careful. If she's hiding something, there's a reason." Nathaniel ended the call and stared at the phone in his hand, his mind racing. He had come here to help Evelyn and her mother, but now he wasn't sure who was helping whom. Later that afternoon, Margaret's eyes fluttered open, and Evelyn let out a small squeal of joy. "Mama, you're awake!" Margaret smiled weakly, reaching out to stroke her daughter's hair. "Hey, my love." Her voice was hoarse, but the warmth in it was unmistakable. Nathaniel stood by the window, watching the reunion in silence. He wanted to let them have their moment, but the questions burning inside him wouldn't wait. "Margaret," he said gently, stepping closer. "Can we talk?" Margaret's smile faded slightly as if she sensed the seriousness in his tone. She nodded, and Evelyn, understanding that the adults needed privacy, kissed her mother's cheek before heading to the sofa with a coloring book. Nathaniel pulled a chair closer to the bed and sat down. his elbows resting on his knees. "I know you're tired, but I need to ask you something important." Margaret's brow furrowed. "What is it?" "You used to work for my family," he said, watching her reaction carefully. Her eyes widened, and for a moment she looked as if she might deny it. But then she sighed and nodded. "Yes, I did. Were you there the night of the fire?" Margaret's hands trembled slightly and she clasped them together to steady herself. "Yes," she whispered. Nathaniel's heart pounded. "Why didn't you ever come forward? Why didn't you tell anyone what you saw?" Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "Because I was scared," she admitted, her voice breaking. "I saw your uncles arguing that night. I heard them talking about money and debts they couldn't pay. I knew something bad was going to happen, but I didn't think they'd go that far. When the fire started, I panicked. I didn't know what to do. I tried to go back inside to find you, but the flames were too strong." Nathaniel's chest tightened. "So you just left?" "I didn't have a choice," Margaret sobbed. "I thought you were dead. Everyone did. When I found out you survived, I wanted to come forward, but your uncles threatened me. They said if I said anything, they'd come after me, and after Evelyn." Nathaniel leaned back in his chair, his mind spinning. All this time he had been searching for answers, and they had been right in front of him. Margaret wasn't just a woman in need. She was a piece of the puzzle he had been trying to solve for years. "I never meant to hurt you," Margaret said, tears streaming down her face. "I'm so sorry, Nathaniel." He stared at her, the weight of her confession settling heavily on his shoulders. He had wanted answers, but now that he had them, he wasn't sure what to do. "Does Evelyn know any of this?" he asked. Margaret shook her head. "No, and I don't want her to. She's just a child. She doesn't need to carry this burden." Nathaniel stood, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. He needed time to think, to process everything he had just learned. "I need to go," he said abruptly, turning toward the door. "Nate, please," Margaret called after him. "Don't shut us out." But he was already gone, the door closing behind him as he walked down the corridor, his mind clouded with anger, confusion, and something else he couldn't name. For the first time in years, Nathaniel West felt completely lost. Nathaniel's footsteps echoed down the marble corridor as he made his way to the clinic's exit, the weight of Margaret's confession crushing him from every direction. The cool afternoon air hit his face as he stepped outside, but it did little to clear the storm raging inside him. The rain had stopped, but the streets were still slick and shining under the gray sky. He shoved his hands deep into the pockets of his coat and began walking, not caring where his feet took him. The city around him blurred into a haze of honking horns, pedestrians rushing by, and the distant hum of subway trains. But all he could hear was Margaret's voice. "I thought you were dead." Everyone did. Nathaniel's mind spiraled, replaying that night over and over. The orange glow of the fire, the suffocating heat, the sound of wood cracking and collapsing. He had been only 7 years old when it happened, but the memories were as vivid as if they had happened yesterday. His parents' laughter had echoed down the hall that evening, a rare moment of joy in a house often filled with tension. His mother had kissed him goodnight and tucked him into bed, promising to read him a story the next night. But the next night never came. Nathaniel clenched his jaw, fighting the sting of tears. He had spent years burying that pain, focusing on building his empire and proving to the world and himself that he didn't need anyone. But now, Margaret's confession had ripped open old wounds. He stopped at the edge of a park, his breath fogging in the cool air as he leaned against a lamppost. A group of children played nearby, their laughter ringing out as they chased each other through the wet grass. For a brief moment, Nathaniel allowed himself to imagine what his life could have been if that fire had never happened. Would he have grown up playing in parks like this, with parents who loved him and no need to build walls around his heart? A gust of wind rustled the trees, pulling him back to reality. He pulled out his phone and dialed David's number, his fingers trembling slightly. "Hey," David answered, his tone cautious. "How are you holding up?" "I talked to her," Nathaniel said, his voice hollow. "She was there the night of the fire. She saw everything, and she knew my uncles were involved. David exhaled sharply. Did she admit to anything else? No. Nathaniel rubbed his forehead. She said she wanted to help, but she was scared. They threatened her, David, that's why she never came forward. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Do you believe her? Nathaniel hesitated. I don't know. I want to, but… He stopped, struggling to find the words. She kept this from me for years. How do I trust someone who stayed silent while my life fell apart? David's voice softened. People do desperate things when they're scared, Nate. Maybe she made the wrong choice, but that doesn't mean she didn't care. You're the one who brought her and Evelyn into your life. If you really believed she was a threat, you wouldn't have done that. Nathaniel sighed, his breath shaky. What if she's hiding something else? Then you'll deal with it, David said firmly. But don't push her away until you know the full truth. If there's more to the story, you need to hear it from her. Nathaniel lowered the phone from his ear and stared at the children in the park. Their carefree innocence a painful contrast to the chaos inside him. He knew David was right, but the thought of facing Margaret again felt like walking back into a burning building. Thanks, he muttered before ending the call. By the time Nathaniel returned to the clinic, the sun was setting, casting a golden glow across the horizon. He paused outside Margaret's room, his hand hovering over the doorknob. He could hear Evelyn giggling softly, and for a moment, he didn't want to interrupt. But he couldn't delay this conversation any longer. He pushed the door open and stepped inside. Evelyn was sitting on the bed, showing her mother the castle drawing she had made earlier. Both of them looked up when Nathaniel entered, and Evelyn's face lit up. Nate, look what I drew. She held up the picture proudly. It's our castle. Mama says she likes it. Nathaniel forced a smile. It's beautiful. Evelyn. Evelyn slid off the bed and ran to him, grabbing his hand. Do you think we can build a real castle one day? Maybe, Nathaniel said, kneeling down to her level. But right now, I need to talk to your mom. Can you give us a minute? Evelyn's smile faltered, but she nodded. Okay, I'll be in the hallway. As the door closed behind her, Nathaniel turned to Margaret, who looked like she had aged years since their last conversation. Her hands twisted nervously in her lap, and her eyes were filled with guilt. Did you tell her? Margaret asked, her voice barely above a whisper. No, Nathaniel replied, sitting down in the chair beside the bed. And I won't, but I need you to tell me everything. No more half-truths, Margaret. If you want me to trust you, I need the whole story. Margaret nodded, tears welling in her eyes. I loved your mother, Nathaniel. She was kind to me when no one else was. She treated me like family. But your uncles, they were cruel. They thought your mother was wasting money on charity and that she was too soft. They were drowning in debt, and they blamed her for it. Nathaniel's fists clenched at the mention of his uncles. That night, Margaret continued, her voice trembling. I overheard them arguing in the study. They were planning something, but I didn't know it would be the fire. I swear, Nathaniel, I didn't know. Nathaniel leaned forward, his eyes locked on hers. But you knew something was wrong. Yes, Margaret admitted, sobbing. I tried to warn your mother, but she didn't believe they would hurt her. She thought she could handle it. Nathaniel's chest tightened. His mother had been strong, but her trust had been her downfall. When the fire started, I was in the kitchen, Margaret said, wiping her tears. I heard the commotion and ran toward your room, but the flames were already spreading. I tried to get to you, but it was too late. She covered her face with her hands. I'm so sorry, Nathaniel. I should have done more. Nathaniel sat silently, his emotions swirling like a hurricane. He wanted to be angry. He wanted to blame her for not saving his family. But as he looked at the broken woman before him, he realized something. She had been a victim too. After a long pause, he reached out and gently placed a hand on hers. You made a mistake, he said softly. But you've been carrying this guilt for years. You didn't light the fire, Margaret. My uncles did. Margaret's sobs grew louder, and Nathaniel squeezed her hand, offering her the forgiveness she hadn't asked for but desperately needed. I'm not saying I can forget what happened, he continued, his voice steady. But I can try to move forward, for Evelyn's sake and for mine. Margaret nodded through her tears, her shoulders shaking with relief. Nathaniel stood, his mind clearer than it had been in days. There was still a long road ahead, but for the first time, he felt like he could see the path, and it led to the truth, no matter how painful it might be. The night had settled over the city like a thick, comforting blanket, but within the clinic's walls, Nathaniel's mind was anything but calm. He leaned against the window of the private room, staring out into the darkness, the city's lights twinkling below like stars. Margaret had finally fallen asleep after their emotional conversation, her tears drying on her cheeks as exhaustion overtook her. In the hallway, Evelyn was curled up on a bench, her little body rising and falling steadily with each breath. A nurse had given her a blanket, and she clutched it tightly, her face buried against her knees. Nathaniel's chest ached as he watched her sleep. This child, so fragile yet so strong, had no idea of the storm swirling around her. A knock on the door snapped him out of his thoughts. David's familiar figure appeared in the doorway, his coat slightly damp from the misty night air. His expression was serious, as it often was, but there was something different in his eyes, something that made Nathaniel's stomach twist. "David," Nathaniel said, walking toward him. "What are you doing here this late?" David stepped inside and closed the door behind him. "I couldn't wait until morning," he said, lowering his voice. "There's something you need to know." Nathaniel gestured toward the empty chairs by the window. "Tell me." David sat down, his fingers tapping nervously on the armrest. "After our last conversation, I did some more digging into your uncles and their involvement with the fire. There were some things that didn't add up, so I reached out to an old contact of mine who worked on the original investigation." Nathaniel's pulse quickened. "And?" David hesitated as if weighing the weight of his next words. "They didn't just plan the fire to cover up their debts, Nate. There was something else they were after. Something your mother had that they wanted." Nathaniel leaned forward, his heart pounding. "What was it?" "A trust fund," David said. "It was set up by your grandparents and was supposed to pass to your mother. But if anything happened to her, the money would go to the next of kin, your uncles." Nathaniel's jaw tightened. "So they killed her for money." David nodded grimly. "But that's not the worst part. The trust fund wasn't just for your mother. It also included a clause about you. If your mother and father died, you were supposed to inherit everything when you turned 18. Your uncles would only have control of the money until then. But with you presumed dead after the fire, they gained full access to the funds." Nathaniel's breath hitched. "They thought I was dead. They wanted you to be dead," David corrected. "That's why they never looked for you. As long as you were gone, they had complete control." Nathaniel stood, pacing the room as anger boiled inside him. He had spent years building his empire, thinking he had left his past behind. But the truth had been lurking in the shadows all along, waiting to strike. "What about Margaret?" Nathaniel asked, his voice tense. "Did she know about the trust fund?" David shook his head. "There's no evidence to suggest she did. From everything I've found, she really was just a housekeeper who got caught in the middle of something bigger." Nathaniel stopped pacing, his hands on his hips as he stared at the floor. "They stole everything," he whispered. "They stole my family, my future, everything. But now you have a chance to get it back," David said, standing. "We can reopen the investigation. With Margaret's testimony and the new evidence, we can take them down." Nathaniel's fists clenched. The thought of facing his uncles again made his blood run cold. But he knew David was right. This was his chance to set things right, not just for himself, but for Evelyn and Margaret too. "Do it," he said finally, his voice firm. "Reopen the investigation. I want them to pay for what they did." David nodded, his expression resolute. "I'll get everything in motion. But there's one more thing you need to know." Nathaniel raised an eyebrow. "What now?" David hesitated before speaking. "Margaret wasn't just working for your family back then. She was hiding something of her own. I found records showing that she had a son before Evelyn. Nathaniel's eyes widened. A son? Yes, David said. His name was James, but he died when he was 2 years old. There was no foul play involved. He had a congenital heart condition. But it explains why Margaret was so protective of you. She had already lost one child. She couldn't bear to lose another. Nathaniel sank into the chair, his mind reeling. Margaret's actions suddenly made sense in a way they hadn't before. She wasn't just protecting herself, she was protecting him, even when it meant keeping painful secrets. What do I do, David? Nathaniel asked, his voice barely above a whisper. How do I move forward from this? David placed a hand on his shoulder. You've already started. You brought Evelyn and Margaret into your life, and that wasn't a mistake. You just have to decide if you're ready to forgive her and let her help you take down the people who really hurt you. Nathaniel nodded slowly, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. I'll think about it. After David left, Nathaniel returned to Margaret's room. The lights were dim, and Evelyn had fallen asleep again on the sofa, her breathing soft and peaceful. Margaret stirred when Nathaniel sat down beside her bed, her eyes fluttering open. Nate, she murmured. I'm here, he said softly. Margaret's gaze searched his face, and she frowned. You've been crying. Nathaniel chuckled weakly. I guess I have. Margaret reached out and took his hand, her grip surprisingly strong. I'm sorry for everything, Nathaniel. I didn't do enough to protect you back then, but I'll do whatever it takes to help you now. Just tell me what you need. Nathaniel looked down at their intertwined hands, her words echoing in his mind. For years, he had carried the weight of that night on his shoulders, blaming himself for surviving when his parents hadn't. But sitting here, with Margaret's hand in his, he realized that maybe he didn't have to carry it alone anymore. I need you to testify, he said quietly. We're reopening the investigation into the fire. If you tell the truth about what you saw, we can take down my uncles. Margaret's eyes filled with tears, but she nodded. I'll do it. Nathaniel exhaled, the tension in his chest loosening ever so slightly. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was a start. As he sat there, watching Margaret drift back to sleep, Nathaniel made another silent promise, to Evelyn, to his mother, and to himself. He would see this through to the end, no matter what it cost him. Because for the first time in years, he had something worth fighting for. Morning sunlight filtered through the clinic windows, casting a soft golden glow across the room. Evelyn stirred awake on the sofa, rubbing her eyes as she adjusted to the brightness. Her first instinct was to check on her mother, and when she saw Margaret still peacefully sleeping, she let out a small sigh of relief. Nathaniel, sitting by the window with a cup of coffee in his hand, had been awake for hours. The night had offered no rest, only more questions and memories that refused to let him go. But seeing Evelyn's sleepy face brought him back to the present. Morning, she said with a yawn, padding over to him. Good morning, Nathaniel replied, his voice warm but tired. He set his coffee down and patted the chair next to him. Did you sleep well? Yeah, Evelyn said as she climbed into the chair. Did you? Nathaniel chuckled softly. Not really. Evelyn tilted her head, her gaze curious. Is it because of Mama? Partly, Nathaniel admitted. And partly because I've got a lot on my mind. Evelyn kicked her feet, which dangled over the edge of the chair. You always seem like you're thinking about something serious, she observed, even when you smile. Nathaniel leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. Sometimes, life gives you things to think about that you can't ignore. Evelyn was quiet for a moment, then asked, Do you ever think about being happy? The question caught Nathaniel off guard. He had spent so long building walls around his emotions that he had almost forgotten what happiness felt like. His success had brought him wealth, power, and respect, but none of it had ever truly made him happy. I don't know, he said honestly. I guess I stopped thinking about that a long time ago. Evelyn frowned, her small brow furrowing in thought. That's sad. I think you deserve to be happy. Nathaniel's chest tightened. He didn't know why her words hit him so hard, but they did. You're a very wise little girl, he said, ruffling her hair. She giggled, her laughter a brief but welcome break from the heaviness that surrounded them. Mama says I'm an old soul. Do you think that's true? Definitely, Nathaniel said with a soft smile. But that's not a bad thing. It means you see things other people don't. Evelyn swung her legs back and forth, her gaze drifting to the window. Do you think Mama's going to be okay? Nathaniel hesitated, knowing that the truth wasn't as simple as a yes or no answer. The doctors are doing everything they can, he said carefully. And your mom is a fighter. She's not giving up. Evelyn nodded, though her eyes betrayed the fear she was trying to hide. I'm trying to be brave, like you said, but sometimes, it's really hard. Nathaniel leaned over and wrapped an arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. Being brave doesn't mean you're not scared. It just means you keep going, even when you are. Evelyn rested her head against him, her small body fitting perfectly against his side. For a moment, Nathaniel allowed himself to feel the weight of her trust. It was a strange feeling, comforting and terrifying all at once. I wish you could stay with us forever, Evelyn murmured. Nathaniel's breath caught in his throat. He didn't know how to respond. Staying with them meant opening himself up to things he had spent his entire life avoiding: attachment, vulnerability, and the risk of loss. But as he looked down at Evelyn, he realized that part of him didn't want to leave. I'm not going anywhere just yet, he said, offering her a small squeeze. I'll be here as long as you need me. Evelyn smiled up at him, her eyes glistening with hope. Then maybe we can be a family, like in the fairy tales. Nathaniel's heart ached at the simplicity of her dream. She didn't want castles or riches. She just wanted someone to stay. We'll see, he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. Later that afternoon, a nurse entered the room to check on Margaret, who was starting to wake up. Evelyn immediately jumped to her side, holding her mother's hand and chatting excitedly about the breakfast she had eaten. Margaret smiled weakly, her eyes flicking to Nathaniel, who stood quietly at the foot of the bed. How are you feeling? He asked. Better, Margaret replied, though her voice was still hoarse. Thank you for everything, Nathaniel. You don't have to thank me, he said. We're in this together. Margaret's eyes softened, and for a moment, she looked as though she wanted to say something more. But before she could, the door opened, and David walked in, carrying a folder tucked under his arm. His expression was serious, and Nathaniel immediately knew that whatever he had to say wasn't good news. Evelyn, Nathaniel said gently, why don't you go to the playroom down the hall for a little while? I think they have coloring books and games there. Evelyn hesitated, glancing between him and her mother. Are you going to talk about grown-up stuff again? Just for a little while, Nathaniel said with a reassuring smile. Okay, she said, reluctantly letting go of her mother's hand. But don't leave without telling me. I promise, Nathaniel said. Once Evelyn was gone, David closed the door and pulled up a chair. He placed the folder on the table and opened it, revealing a stack of documents and photos. I dug deeper into the financial records tied to the trust fund, he began. Your uncles funneled millions into offshore accounts after the fire. They covered their tracks well, but I found enough to link them to the embezzlement. Nathaniel's eyes darkened. So they didn't just steal from me, they laundered the money too. David nodded. And that's not all. I found an old police report from the night of the fire. A witness came forward back then, but their statement was never officially logged. It's possible someone was paid off to bury it. Margaret's face paled. Who was the witness? David slid a piece of paper across the table. Nathaniel picked it up, his hands trembling slightly as he read the name, Henry Ross. I don't know him, Nathaniel said, frowning. Margaret's eyes widened, and she covered her mouth with her hand. I do, she whispered. Nathaniel's gaze snapped to her. Who is he? He was the gardener, Margaret said, her voice shaking. He was there that night. He must have seen something. David leaned forward. If we can find him, he could be the key to proving your uncle's involvement. Nathaniel nodded, determination hardening his features. Then we find him, no matter what it takes. Margaret hesitated. Nathaniel, if Henry saw something and didn't come forward all these years, there's a reason. He could be in danger. Then I'll protect him, Nathaniel said firmly. Just like I'm protecting you and Evelyn. I'm not letting them get away with this. For the first time, Margaret saw the boy she had once cared for. The boy who had lost everything but refused to be broken. And for the first time, she believed that maybe, just maybe, they could win this fight. Nathaniel stood, his mind racing with plans. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, but the picture they were forming was darker and more dangerous than he had anticipated. But he had made a promise, to himself, to Evelyn, and to the memory of his parents. He wouldn't stop until justice was served. The next morning, the clinic's hallways were filled with the soft murmur of nurses exchanging patient updates and the occasional hum of machinery. The warm scent of freshly brewed coffee wafted through the air. But Nathaniel didn't feel the slightest bit of comfort. His mind was locked on a single name, Henry Ross, the man who might hold the key to everything. Evelyn sat at the breakfast table near her mother's bed, happily munching on a stack of pancakes the nurses had brought her. Every few bites, she would glance up at Margaret to see if her mother was eating too. Margaret smiled weakly and took small bites, but Nathaniel could see the exhaustion weighing her down. "Do you like it, Mama?" Evelyn asked with a bright smile, syrup clinging to the corner of her mouth. "It's delicious, sweetheart," Margaret said, her voice soft. Nathaniel, standing by the window, watched them with a protective gaze. The sight of Evelyn's joy, despite everything they were going through, made him feel both proud and uneasy. She didn't know the full weight of the storm brewing around them, and he intended to keep it that way. His phone buzzed and he excused himself into the hallway. David's name flashed on the screen and Nathaniel immediately answered. "Did you find him?" "I tracked down a few possible leads," David said, "but none of them have panned out so far. Henry Ross left the city shortly after the fire and hasn't been seen since. He didn't have much of a paper trail. No credit cards. No social media, nothing. It's like he vanished." Nathaniel clenched his jaw. "Keep looking, he's out there somewhere." "I'm not giving up," David assured him, "but I have to warn you. If your uncles know we're looking for him, they could make a move to silence him permanently." Nathaniel's blood ran cold at the thought. He leaned against the wall, taking a deep breath. "Then we have to find him first. I'll call you as soon as I have something," David promised. Nathaniel ended the call and stuffed his phone back into his pocket, his mind racing. If Henry Ross really had seen something that night, he could be in danger, and Nathaniel couldn't afford to lose him. He returned to the room, where Evelyn had finished her breakfast and was now sitting cross-legged on the bed next to her mother, showing her a drawing of a garden filled with flowers and butterflies. Margaret's smile was faint but genuine, and Nathaniel felt a brief wave of relief. At least for now. They had this moment of peace. "Nate, look," Evelyn said excitedly, holding up the drawing. "I made this for Mama so she can imagine sitting in a pretty garden when she gets better." Nathaniel smiled, though the heaviness in his chest remained. "It's beautiful, Evelyn. You're really talented. Do you think we can visit a real garden someday?" she asked, her eyes shining with hope. "We'll make it happen," Nathaniel said, ruffling her hair. Margaret watched the exchange with a bittersweet expression. "Thank you," she whispered to Nathaniel when Evelyn wasn't looking, "for giving her something to believe in." Nathaniel nodded, but he couldn't shake the feeling that time was slipping through their fingers. By the afternoon, David had called with an update. "We found a trail," he said, excitement in his voice. "Henry Ross is living in a small town upstate, about 3 hours from here. I already sent someone to confirm it's him." Nathaniel's heart pounded. "And if it is?" "I'll text you the address," David said. "But Nate, be careful. If this guy has been hiding all these years, it's for a reason. He might not be happy to see you." "I'll handle it," Nathaniel said firmly. After ending the call, he returned to the room and found Evelyn playing with a set of crayons while Margaret rested. She looked up when he entered, her face lighting up. "Are you leaving?" she asked, noticing the change in his expression. "Just for a little while," Nathaniel said. "There's something I need to do." "Will you come back soon?" Evelyn's voice wavered slightly, and Nathaniel felt a pang of guilt. "I promise," he said, kneeling down to her level. "Take care of your mom while I'm gone, okay?" Evelyn nodded, her small hand clutching his. "I will." Nathaniel stood and gave Margaret a reassuring glance. "I'll call if anything happens," he said. Margaret nodded, though worry flickered in her eyes. "Be safe, Nathaniel." The drive upstate was long and quiet, with only the hum of the car engine and the occasional sound of rain tapping against the windshield. Nathaniel's grip on the steering wheel tightened as he replayed everything David had told him. If Henry Ross had witnessed something that night, he might be the missing piece Nathaniel needed to bring his uncles to justice. But there was also the possibility that Henry had spent the past 2 decades trying to forget that night, and confronting him could stir up more than just old memories. When Nathaniel finally arrived at the small town, it felt like stepping back in time. The streets were lined with old-fashioned lampposts, and the storefronts had the charm of a place untouched by the chaos of the city. He parked the car outside a small, weathered house with a wooden porch and overgrown shrubs. Taking a deep breath, he stepped out of the car and approached the door. His knock echoed through the quiet neighborhood, and for a moment, he thought no one would answer. But then the door creaked open, revealing an older man with gray hair and tired eyes. "Henry Ross?" Nathaniel asked. The man's eyes narrowed. "Who's asking?" "My name is Nathaniel West," he said, his voice steady. "I believe you knew my family." Henry's expression darkened, and he began to close the door. But Nathaniel quickly placed his hand against it, stopping him. "Please," he said, his tone softening. "I'm not here to cause trouble. I just need answers." Henry hesitated, then sighed and opened the door wider. "Come in," he said reluctantly. Nathaniel stepped inside, taking in the worn furniture and the faint smell of coffee. The house was small but cozy, with pictures of Henry's family lining the walls. Henry gestured for him to sit on the couch. "I figured someone would come looking for me eventually," he said, sinking into an armchair across from Nathaniel. "I just didn't think it would take this long." Nathaniel leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "You were there the night of the fire. You saw what happened." Henry's gaze shifted to the floor, and for a moment, he said nothing. Then with a heavy sigh, he nodded. "I saw more than I ever wanted to." "What did you see?" Nathaniel's voice was tense, his breath shallow. Henry rubbed his hands together, his fingers trembling slightly. "I was outside trimming the hedges when I heard shouting coming from the house. Your uncles were arguing with your mother about the money. She was trying to convince them to leave, but they wouldn't listen. I didn't think much of it at the time. I just assumed it was another family disagreement." He paused, his eyes glassy with memory. "But then, later that night, I saw them again. They were carrying gasoline cans around the side of the house. I thought it was strange, but I didn't realize what they were planning until I saw the flames." Nathaniel's stomach twisted. "Did you try to stop them?" "I wanted to," Henry said, his voice cracking. "But by the time I got close, the fire had already spread. I ran to get help, but it was too late. Your parents were trapped inside." Nathaniel sat back, his mind racing. "Why didn't you tell the police?" "I was scared," Henry admitted. "Your uncles were powerful men, and they made sure I knew what would happen if I talked. So I left. I've been living with the guilt ever since." Nathaniel clenched his fists, struggling to contain his anger. "Well, you're going to talk now," he said firmly. "We're reopening the investigation, and your testimony could change everything." Henry hesitated, then nodded. "If it means finally getting justice for your family, I'll do it." Nathaniel's chest tightened, a mixture of relief and determination flooding through him. For the first time in years, the path forward was clear. He had the witness, the evidence, and the resolve to take down the men who had destroyed his family. As he left the house and stepped into the cool evening air, Nathaniel felt a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in a long time. The pieces were falling into place, and he was ready to finish what his mother had started. The sun had just begun its slow descent, casting a golden hue over the city as Nathaniel drove back toward Manhattan. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, his thoughts moving as fast as the car. He had spent years avoiding the pain of his family's betrayal, but now, with Henry Ross's testimony, he was ready to confront it head-on. He glanced at his phone on the passenger seat, the screen lighting up with a message from David. "We've got enough to file a motion to reopen the case. Call me when you're back." The weight of what they were about to do pressed down on Nathaniel's chest. His uncles had taken everything from him, his parents, his home, his childhood. And now, it was his turn to take everything from them. By the time he arrived at the clinic, the sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving the city bathed in the soft glow of streetlights. He parked his car and took a deep breath before stepping inside. The familiar scent of antiseptic greeted him as he made his way to Margaret's room. He stopped outside the door, peeking through the small window. Evelyn was sitting on the bed next to her mother, giggling as she read a book aloud. Margaret's hand rested on her daughter's knee, her eyes closed but a smile playing on her lips. Nathaniel hesitated. He didn't want to interrupt this rare moment of peace, but they needed to know what was coming. He knocked softly before entering. Evelyn's face lit up when she saw him. "Nate, you're back." "Hey, Princess," he said, walking over to her. "Did you have a good day?" "Yes, Mom and I played a word game and I won 3 times, she said proudly. Margaret chuckled weakly. "She's been keeping me on my toes." Nathaniel smiled, but the seriousness of the situation soon returned. "Evelyn, can you give your mom and me a moment to talk?" Evelyn's smile faltered, but she nodded. "Okay, I'll be in the playroom." She leaned over and kissed her mother on the cheek before hopping off the bed. "Don't talk about anything too boring, okay?" "We won't," Nathaniel promised, ruffling her hair as she skipped out of the room. Once the door closed, Nathaniel pulled a chair closer to Margaret's bed. Her smile faded as she took in his expression. "What's wrong?" "I found him," Nathaniel said. "Henry Ross. He's agreed to testify." Margaret's eyes widened. "Oh my God, that's incredible." "It is," Nathaniel said, leaning forward. "But this also means we're officially going to war. Once we file the motion to reopen the case, my uncles will know we're coming for them. They're not going to go down without a fight." Margaret swallowed hard, her fingers clutching the blanket. "What do you need me to do?" "Be ready," Nathaniel said. "David's team will be in touch to get your official statement. After that, things are going to move quickly. We're going to expose them for everything they did." Margaret nodded, but her gaze drifted toward the window where the city lights flickered in the distance. "Do you ever wonder what your life would have been like if the fire hadn't happened?" Nathaniel followed her gaze, his chest tightening. "Every day," he admitted. "But thinking about what could have been doesn't change what is. All we can do now is make sure they pay for what they did." Margaret looked back at him, tears welling in her eyes. "I'm so sorry, Nathaniel. I know I've said it before, but I need you to know how much I regret not doing more." Nathaniel reached out and took her hand, squeezing it gently. "I know, Margaret, and I forgive you. We're in this together now." A tear slipped down her cheek, but this time it wasn't one of guilt. It was relief. That night, Nathaniel returned to his penthouse apartment for the first time in days. The sleek modern space felt cold and empty, compared to the warmth of the clinic, where Evelyn's laughter and Margaret's quiet strength had filled the air. He poured himself a glass of scotch and sank into the leather armchair by the window, staring out at the city below. The phone buzzed on the table beside him, and he picked it up to see another message from David. "I've scheduled the meeting with the DA. We'll make the announcement in the morning." Nathaniel took a sip of his drink, the warmth spreading through his chest. Morning would come quickly, and with it, the first step toward justice. But as he set the glass down, a thought gnawed at the back of his mind. His uncles weren't the type to wait quietly while their empire crumbled. He grabbed his phone and dialed David. The line rang twice before his friend picked up. "What's up?" David asked. "I need you to hire security for Margaret and Evelyn," Nathaniel said. "I don't trust my uncles not to retaliate." David didn't hesitate. "Consider it done. I'll have someone there by morning." "Thanks," Nathaniel said, exhaling slowly. "I'm not taking any chances." "Good," David replied. "Because if we're right, your uncles are about to lose everything, and desperate men do desperate things." Nathaniel ended the call and leaned back in the chair, his gaze fixed on the city lights. He had spent years chasing success, thinking it would fill the void left by his family's death. But now, he realized that no amount of money or power could replace what he had lost. But justice, that was something he could control. The next morning, Nathaniel arrived at the clinic just as the sun was rising, casting a soft pink glow across the skyline. Security guards were stationed near the entrance, their presence discreet but reassuring. He nodded at one of them before making his way to Margaret's room. Inside, he found Evelyn sitting on the bed, braiding her mother's hair while they laughed about something. The sight warmed Nathaniel's heart. But he knew the peace wouldn't last much longer. "Good morning," he said, stepping inside. Evelyn beamed. "Nate, look at Mama's hair. I made her a princess braid." Nathaniel chuckled. "You did a great job. You could be a hairstylist someday." Evelyn giggled and hopped off the bed. "I'm going to find more ribbons to decorate it." She ran out of the room, leaving Nathaniel and Margaret alone. Margaret's smile faded as she met his gaze. "It's happening today, isn't it?" Nathaniel nodded. "David's meeting with the DA as we speak. Once the motion is approved, the investigation will officially be reopened." Margaret exhaled, her hands trembling slightly. "Do you think they'll come after us?" "I won't let them get near you or Evelyn," Nathaniel said firmly. "I've hired security. You're protected." Margaret looked down at her hands, her fingers twisting the edge of the blanket. "I'm scared, Nathaniel. Not for me, for Evelyn. She's been through so much already." "I know," Nathaniel said softly, sitting down beside her. "But we're going to get through this. I won't let them take anything else from us." Margaret nodded, tears brimming in her eyes. "Thank you for everything." Nathaniel reached out and took her hand, squeezing it gently. "We're almost there. Just hold on a little longer." As he sat beside her, the weight of the past and the uncertainty of the future pressed down on him. But deep inside, a spark of hope flickered. They had come this far, and he wasn't going to let fear stop them now. Outside the window, the city hummed with life, unaware of the battle unfolding within its walls. But soon, the truth would come to light, and with it the justice his family deserved. The clinic's lobby was quiet in the early morning, save for the soft hum of a coffee machine and the distant shuffle of nurses beginning their shifts. Nathaniel sat in a corner chair, his phone pressed to his ear as he listened to David's update. "It's done," David said. "The DA agreed to reopen the investigation. I just finished filing the motion in court. By the end of the day, your uncles will know exactly what's happening." Nathaniel exhaled, relief mixing with the tension that refused to leave his body. "How long until the subpoenas are issued? A few days?" "Maybe less," David replied. "We've already submitted Margaret's statement and Henry Ross's testimony. It's airtight, Nate. There's no way they can wiggle out of this without facing charges." Nathaniel leaned back in his chair, tapping his fingers on the armrest. "Then they'll come for us." "I'm afraid so," David admitted. "That's why you've got security. I've vetted the team myself. They'll stay close to Margaret and Evelyn 24/7. You should be safe." Nathaniel rubbed his temple, the pressure behind his eyes building. He had known this wouldn't be easy, but now that the wheels were in motion, the weight of it all felt suffocating. "Thanks, David," he said quietly. "Keep me updated." "Will do," David replied. "And Nate, be careful." Nathaniel ended the call and stared at the phone in his hand for a moment before standing and heading toward Margaret's room. He passed the two security guards stationed outside the door and nodded to them before stepping inside. Margaret was sitting up in bed, flipping through a magazine while Evelyn played with a stuffed rabbit on the floor. The sight was deceptively peaceful, but Nathaniel's mind was anything but. "Did David call?" Margaret asked, setting the magazine aside. Nathaniel nodded. "The investigation's officially reopened. By tonight, my uncles will know they're being targeted." Margaret's expression darkened, and she glanced toward Evelyn, who was still happily immersed in her game. "What do we do now?" "Wait," Nathaniel said, sitting down beside her, "and be ready for anything." Margaret's fingers twisted in her lap. A nervous habit Nathaniel had come to recognize. "They won't let this go without a fight." "I know," Nathaniel said, his voice steady. "But we're not the same people we were back then. We have the truth on our side now." Margaret's eyes filled with tears, but she quickly wiped them away. "I just want Evelyn to be safe." "She will be," Nathaniel promised. "I won't let them touch her." Margaret nodded, though the fear in her eyes remained. "Thank you, Nathaniel, for not giving up on us." He reached over and squeezed her hand. "Your family. I'm not giving up." By mid-afternoon, the tension in the air had grown thicker. Nathaniel paced the clinic's corridors, his mind racing as he replayed every possible scenario. His phone buzzed with a text from David. "Subpoenas have been issued. It's official." Nathaniel exhaled sharply, tucking his phone back into his pocket. The final domino had been set in motion, and now it was only a matter of time before his uncles made their move. As he turned the corner, he nearly collided with Evelyn, who was skipping down the hallway with her stuffed rabbit in hand. She giggled and looked up at him, her smile bright and full of innocence. "Where are you going in such a hurry?" Nathaniel asked, crouching down to her level. "I was going to get more crayons from the nurse," she said. "Mama said I could make another picture for you." Nathaniel's chest tightened. He placed a hand on her shoulder, steadying himself. "I'd love that," he said softly. "But can I ask you a favor?" Evelyn nodded eagerly. "Anything. Stay close to your mom for the rest of the day, okay? I just want to make sure you're both safe." Evelyn's smile faded slightly, but she nodded. "Is something bad going to happen?" Nathaniel hesitated, then shook his head. "No, Princess. I'm just being extra careful." "Okay," she said, hugging him tightly before running off toward the nurse's station. Nathaniel stood and watched her go, the knot in his chest tightening. She deserved a childhood free from fear and danger, and he was determined to give her that, even if it meant confronting the darkest parts of his past. By the time night fell, the city outside the clinic was alive with the glow of streetlights and the distant sounds of traffic. Nathaniel sat by the window in Margaret's room, his gaze fixed on the skyline as he sipped a cup of coffee. Margaret was asleep, her breathing even and calm, while Evelyn lay curled up on the sofa with her stuffed rabbit tucked under her arm. The quiet was interrupted by a knock on the door. One of the security guards stepped inside, his expression tense. "Mr. West, there's a man in the lobby asking to see you. Says his name is Stephen West." Nathaniel's blood ran cold. Stephen was his uncle, the more ruthless of the two brothers, and the one Nathaniel had always feared the most. He set his coffee down and stood, his body tensing like a coiled spring. "Stay here," he told the guard. "Don't let anyone near Margaret or Evelyn." The guard nodded, and Nathaniel stepped into the hallway, his mind racing. He made his way to the lobby where Stephen West stood near the entrance, his presence as commanding and sinister as ever. His tailored suit fit him perfectly, and his sharp eyes scanned the room like a predator assessing its prey. "Nathaniel," Stephen said, a cold smile spreading across his face as Nathaniel approached. "It's been a long time." "Not long enough," Nathaniel replied, keeping his tone steady. "What are you doing here?" Stephen's smile widened, but there was no warmth behind it. "I heard you've been busy digging up the past. Thought we should have a little chat before things get messy." Nathaniel crossed his arms, refusing to be intimidated. "There's nothing to talk about. The investigation is open and you can't stop it." "Maybe not," Stephen admitted, his eyes narrowing. "But you should know, Nathaniel, that when you dig too deep you might find things you wish you hadn't." Nathaniel's fists clenched at his sides. "Is that a threat?" "It's a warning," Stephen said, stepping closer. "You think you've won because you found a couple of witnesses and some old documents? You're playing a dangerous game, and you're dragging that little girl and her mother into it. Are you sure you're ready to live with the consequences?" Nathaniel's pulse pounded in his ears. But he forced himself to stay calm. "I'm not the one who should be worried about consequences, Stephen. That's you. You and Uncle Richard stole my life, and now you're going to pay for it." Stephen's smile faltered, replaced by a flicker of anger. "We'll see about that." He turned and walked toward the exit. Nathaniel's breath hitched, but he didn't respond. He watched as Stephen disappeared into the night, his mind spinning with fear and fury. When he returned to Margaret's room, he found her awake, her eyes wide with worry. "Was that him?" she asked. Nathaniel nodded, his jaw tight. "It was." "What did he say?" Nathaniel sat down beside her and took her hand. "He threatened us," he admitted. "But I'm not letting them win, Margaret. I've come too far to back down now." Margaret squeezed his hand, tears brimming in her eyes. "Then we fight," she said, her voice steady despite the fear. "We fight together." Nathaniel nodded, his resolve hardening. He had spent years running from his past, but now he was ready to face it head-on. And no matter what Stephen or Richard West tried to do, he wouldn't stop until justice was served. The next morning, the city stirred to life with its usual rhythm. Honking taxis, the distant hum of subway trains, and pedestrians hurrying down the crowded sidewalks. But for Nathaniel West, the day felt anything but ordinary. He stood by the window of Margaret's hospital room, staring out at the skyline, as if it held the answers to all the questions that plagued him. Margaret was sitting up in bed, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea. Evelyn sat cross-legged on the floor, drawing a picture of a castle surrounded by gardens, her small hands moving quickly across the paper. The innocence of her creativity felt like a cruel contrast to the storm brewing just outside these walls. A knock on the door broke Nathaniel's trance, and when he turned, he found David stepping inside, a briefcase in hand and a grim expression on his face. Nathaniel's stomach tightened. Whatever David had to say, it wasn't good news. "Morning," David said, offering a nod to Margaret and Evelyn before focusing on Nathaniel. "We need to talk." Margaret immediately picked up on the seriousness of the situation. "Evelyn, why don't you go show the nurse your drawing? I'm sure she'd love to see it." Evelyn hesitated, looking between her mother and Nathaniel. "Is everything okay?" "It's fine, sweetheart," Margaret said, her smile gentle but forced. "Just grown-up stuff." Evelyn nodded and gathered her crayons before skipping out of the room. As soon as the door closed, the atmosphere shifted, the weight of the conversation pressing down on them. "What is it?" Nathaniel asked, motioning for David to sit. David placed the briefcase on the table and opened it, pulling out a stack of papers. "Stephen and Richard are already fighting back. Their lawyers filed a motion to dismiss the investigation, claiming lack of evidence and witness credibility. They're also trying to have Henry Ross's testimony thrown out, saying he's an unreliable witness because he waited so long to come forward." Nathaniel's jaw tightened. "Of course they are. There's more," David said, sliding a document toward him. "They've started contacting people in your business network. They're trying to turn your investors and board members against you, painting this as a desperate attempt for revenge that's going to hurt the company's reputation." Nathaniel leaned back in his chair, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. His uncles weren't just fighting to protect themselves. They were coming for everything he had built. "Let them try," Nathaniel said, his voice cold. "I've faced worse threats than this." David nodded, but his expression remained serious. "We can counter their legal moves. But it's going to get messy. The media's already sniffing around. Once the press gets wind of the family feud, they'll turn it into a spectacle." Margaret shifted uncomfortably in her bed. "What about Evelyn? I don't want her dragged into this." "She won't be," Nathaniel said firmly. "I've hired additional security. No one's getting near her or you." David hesitated before speaking. "I also have one more piece of information. and you're not going to like it." Nathaniel's stomach dropped. "What is it?" "Stephen and Richard have connections to the judge overseeing the case," David said quietly. "There's a chance they'll try to influence him. I've seen them pull strings before." Nathaniel stood abruptly, pacing the room as anger boiled inside him. "So, they're going to buy their way out of this, just like they always do." "Not if we play our cards right," David said. "We have public opinion on our side. Once we release Henry's testimony to the media, it'll be harder for the judge to sweep this under the rug without facing backlash." Nathaniel stopped pacing and faced David. "Then do it. Release the statement. Let the world know what they did." David nodded, already pulling out his phone to make the necessary calls. "I'll handle it, but Nate, be prepared. Once this goes public, there's no going back. They'll come at you with everything they have." "Let them," Nathaniel said, his voice like steel. "I'm done running." Later that afternoon, the first wave of media coverage hit. News channels broadcasted breaking reports detailing the reopened investigation into the fire that had killed Nathaniel's parents. Headlines splashed across websites and newspapers. "Billionaire heir Nathaniel West seeks justice against family betrayal." The story spread like wildfire, and within hours reporters were swarming outside Nathaniel's company headquarters in the clinic. Security guards had to escort employees in and out of the building, while photographers camped outside the clinic hoping to catch a glimpse of him. Inside the clinic, Evelyn sat on the sofa, coloring quietly as Margaret watched the news coverage on a small television mounted on the wall. Her face was pale, and her hands trembled slightly as she clutched the blanket around her shoulders. Nathaniel entered the room and immediately turned off the TV. "You don't need to see that," he said gently. Margaret looked up at him, tears brimming in her eyes. "This is all my fault. If I had come forward earlier—" "Stop," Nathaniel interrupted, sitting down beside her. "We're here now, and that's what matters. Don't blame yourself for something my uncles did." Margaret wiped her eyes and nodded, but the guilt lingered in her expression. "What if they come after Evelyn?" "They won't get the chance," Nathaniel said, his tone leaving no room for doubt. "I won't let them near her." Margaret exhaled shakily, her gaze drifting to her daughter, who was humming softly as she colored. "She doesn't know how much danger we're in, does she?" "No," Nathaniel said, "and she doesn't need to. She deserves to feel safe, even if it's just for a little while." Margaret reached out and took his hand. "Thank you." "Nathaniel, I don't know what we would have done without you." Nathaniel squeezed her hand gently. "We're going to get through this, I promise." That night, Nathaniel returned to his apartment to regroup. The penthouse, usually a place of solitude, felt suffocating as he paced the floor, his mind spinning with strategies and contingency plans. He checked his phone repeatedly, waiting for updates from David. At around midnight, his phone buzzed with a text. "Call me, urgent." Nathaniel dialed David's number, his pulse quickening. "What's going on?" "Stephen and Richard aren't wasting any time," David said. "They filed an emergency injunction to halt the investigation, claiming it's based on fabricated evidence. The judge is reviewing it first thing in the morning." Nathaniel's fists clenched. "What are our chances of stopping it?" "Honestly, it depends on how much influence they have over the judge," David admitted. "But there's something else. I got a tip from one of my contacts. They've hired someone to dig into your personal life. They're looking for anything they can use against you." Nathaniel's mind raced. What could they possibly find? "They don't need anything real," David said. "Just something they can twist into a scandal. Be prepared for anything." Nathaniel exhaled sharply, his chest tightening. "Thanks for the warning. I'll be ready." After ending the call, Nathaniel stood by the window, staring out at the city below. The weight of the battle ahead pressed down on him, but he refused to let it break him. His uncles had stolen his family, his childhood, and his peace of mind. But they wouldn't take anything else, not Evelyn, not Margaret, and not the justice his parents deserved. Tomorrow the fight would continue. But tonight, Nathaniel allowed himself a moment to breathe, to remember why he was doing this. He wasn't just fighting for revenge. He was fighting for the family he had found in Margaret and Evelyn, a family he wouldn't lose again. The morning sky was an ominous gray, clouds swirling like a brewing storm waiting to break loose. Nathaniel had barely slept, his mind cycling through every possible outcome of the day ahead. By the time the sun rose, he was already dressed in a crisp suit, standing in front of the large floor-to-ceiling window of his penthouse apartment. He sipped his coffee in silence, waiting for David's update. At exactly 7:45 a.m., his phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. He didn't hesitate. "Tell me you have good news," Nathaniel said, walking toward the window as he answered the call. David sighed on the other end of the line. "I wish I could." The emergency injunction hearing didn't go our way. The judge granted a temporary pause on the investigation pending further review. Nathaniel's grip on the phone tightened. "So, they've bought themselves more time." "For now, yes," David replied. "But we can still fight this. The evidence we have is strong, and public opinion is turning against them. We just need to be patient." Nathaniel exhaled sharply, pacing the room. Patience wasn't his strong suit, especially when it came to people like Stephen and Richard. "What about the media?" "That's the other thing," David said, his tone more serious now. "They're retaliating. A few outlets are already running stories about you, mostly vague accusations, but they're painting you as a man obsessed with revenge." Nathaniel's jaw clenched. "Of course they are. There's more," David continued. "I got a tip this morning that they're planning to leak something big. They found something, or they fabricated it, to make you look like a threat to your own company and reputation." Nathaniel's heart pounded, but his voice remained steady. "What do they have?" "I'm not sure yet, but we'll know soon," David replied. "Stay ready, Nate. This could hit the news cycle within hours." Nathaniel ended the call, his mind spinning. He had expected a fight, but not one this dirty, this personal. The thought of Evelyn or Margaret seeing something damaging about him on TV made his stomach churn. He had promised to protect them, but how could he shield them from a war that was unfolding on every screen and headline in the country? At the clinic, the atmosphere was surprisingly calm. Evelyn was sitting cross-legged on the floor with a puzzle spread out in front of her, humming softly as she pieced it together. Margaret was propped up in bed, sipping tea while flipping through a magazine. When Nathaniel entered, Evelyn jumped to her feet and ran to him, wrapping her arms around his waist. "You're back." Nathaniel smiled and knelt down to hug her. "I told you I wouldn't be gone for long." Margaret set her tea aside, her gaze scanning Nathaniel's face. She could sense the tension radiating off him. "What happened?" Nathaniel stood and walked to the window, his hands in his pockets as he stared out at the city. "They're hitting back harder than we expected. The investigation is temporarily on hold, and they're planning to smear me in the press." Margaret's face paled. "What kind of smear?" "I don't know yet," Nathaniel admitted. "But whatever it is, they're going to try to destroy my credibility." Margaret's hands trembled as she reached for him. "Nathaniel, this isn't just about you anymore. They'll come after Evelyn and me too. We can't let them win." "I know," Nathaniel said, his voice firm. "But they won't win. I won't let them." Just as he spoke, his phone buzzed with an alert. He pulled it out of his pocket and felt his blood run cold. A news notification flashed across the screen. "Breaking. Nathaniel West accused of fraud in multi-million-dollar company deal." His breath hitched as he opened the article, scanning the accusations. The story claimed that Nathaniel had manipulated financial records during a major acquisition, inflating the value of a company to secure a more favorable deal. Anonymous sources within his company were quoted, alleging that Nathaniel's actions had put the company at risk of collapse. Margaret watched his face darken. "What is it?" "They're accusing me of fraud," Nathaniel said through gritted teeth. "They're saying I falsified documents to secure a business deal." Margaret's hand flew to her mouth. "That's not true, is it?" "Of course not," Nathaniel said, pacing the room. "But that doesn't matter. They've planted the seed, and now the media will run with it." Evelyn looked up from her puzzle, sensing the shift in the room. "Is something wrong, Nate?" Nathaniel forced a smile and knelt down beside her. No, sweetheart. Everything's fine. Keep working on your puzzle, okay? Okay, she said, though her brow furrowed in concern. Nathaniel stood and pulled out his phone, dialing David's number. It rang once before David picked up. I saw the news, David said without preamble. I've already contacted the legal team. We're drafting a public statement denying the accusations. Who leaked it? Nathaniel asked, his voice cold. I'm still working on that, David replied. But my guess is Stephen or Richard paid someone off. The timing is too perfect. Nathaniel rubbed his temples, the pressure in his head building. What's our next move? First, we issue the denial, David said. Then, we file a defamation lawsuit against the outlet that published the story. But the real battle is going to be in the court of public opinion. We need to turn this around before it damages your reputation permanently. Nathaniel nodded, even though David couldn't see him. Do whatever you have to do. After ending the call, he turned back to Margaret, who was watching him with a mixture of worry and determination. I need you to stay calm, Nathaniel said. This is going to get worse before it gets better, but I won't let them drag you or Evelyn into it. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. I trust you, Nathaniel. I just don't want Evelyn to lose the only good thing we've had in years. Nathaniel walked over and took her hand. She won't. We're going to get through this together. That evening, as the media storm intensified, Nathaniel's phone buzzed constantly with calls and messages. Reporters camped outside the clinic, their cameras ready to capture any glimpse of him or Margaret. Security guards escorted nurses and visitors in and out, keeping the press at bay. Nathaniel stayed by Margaret's side. His presence a silent promise that he wouldn't let anything happen to her or Evelyn. At one point, Evelyn climbed onto his lap, her arms wrapped around his neck. Are you sad, Nate? She asked, her voice soft. Nathaniel swallowed the lump in his throat and kissed the top of her head. No, princess. I'm just thinking about how lucky I am to have you and your mom in my life. Evelyn smiled and rested her head against his chest. We're lucky to have you too. As she drifted off to sleep, Nathaniel held her close, his gaze fixed on the window. The world outside was filled with chaos, but in this room, he found a moment of peace. But peace wouldn't last forever. Tomorrow he would face the media, the public, and the legal system. Tomorrow, the battle would continue. But tonight, Nathaniel allowed himself to feel something he hadn't felt in years: hope. Because despite everything, he wasn't fighting alone anymore. He had a family worth fighting for, and he wasn't going to lose them. Morning arrived with the glare of flashing cameras and the hum of news vans parked outside the clinic. Nathaniel had barely slept, his mind restless with strategy, fear, and anger. He stood by the window, his gaze fixed on the crowd of reporters gathered near the entrance. Their microphones poised for sound bites, their cameras ready to capture any moment of weakness. Behind him, Margaret stirred in her bed, her voice soft and groggy. It's worse today, isn't it? Nathaniel turned to face her, offering a small smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. The media's having a field day. Margaret sighed, sinking back into the pillows. I feel like this is all my fault. It's not, Nathaniel said firmly, walking over to her. You didn't leak that story. My uncles did. They're desperate, and this is how they fight. Margaret nodded, though her expression remained clouded with guilt. How do we stop them? By not letting them win, Nathaniel replied. David's team is handling the legal side, and I'm going to address the press today. I'm not hiding from this. Margaret's eyes widened. Are you sure that's a good idea? They'll twist whatever you say. They can try, Nathaniel said, his voice hardening. But I'm not going to sit back and let them control the narrative. I've spent my whole life running from my past. Not anymore. The door opened and Evelyn peeked inside, her stuffed rabbit tucked under her arm. Is everything okay? Nathaniel softened instantly, crouching down to her level. Everything's fine, princess. I'm just going to go outside for a little bit to talk to some people. Evelyn frowned. her gaze darting toward the window where the cameras were visible. Are those the bad people Mama talked about? Nathaniel's chest tightened. He glanced at Margaret, who looked equally pained. They're just people asking questions, he said carefully. But don't worry, I'm going to make sure they don't bother you or your mom. Evelyn hugged him tightly. Her small arms wrapped around his neck. Be careful, Nate. I will, he promised, kissing the top of her head before standing. Stay inside, okay? I'll be back soon. Margaret reached for his hand as he passed her bed. You don't have to do this alone. Nathaniel squeezed her hand gently. I know, but this is something I need to do. As Nathaniel made his way through the clinic's corridors, his pulse quickened. Security guards flanked him, their presence a reminder of the threat lurking just outside. By the time he reached the entrance, the noise from the reporters was deafening. Questions were being shouted. Flashes from cameras momentarily blinded him, but Nathaniel didn't flinch. He stepped forward, his gaze steady as he faced the crowd. Mr. West, did you falsify financial records? Is it true you're using this investigation as a cover for revenge? Have you been lying to your shareholders? The questions came fast and furious. But Nathaniel raised his hand, signaling for silence. Slowly, the noise died down, and all eyes turned to him. He could feel the weight of their judgment, the pressure of their expectations, but he wasn't here to crumble under it. I know what you've heard, Nathaniel began, his voice steady and strong. The allegations against me are false. I did not commit fraud, and I'm confident that the investigation will prove that. What you're seeing is the result of a desperate attempt by my uncles to discredit me and protect themselves from the consequences of their actions. The crowd murmured, and a reporter raised her hand. What evidence do you have to support your claims? Nathaniel took a deep breath. I have witnesses who were there the night my parents died. I have documents that tie Stephen and Richard West to embezzlement and arson. This investigation isn't about revenge. It's about justice for my family. And for everything that was stolen from me. Another reporter stepped forward. What about your company? Are you worried about how this will affect your investors? Nathaniel's gaze hardened. My company was built on integrity, hard work, and resilience. I've faced challenges before, and I'll face this one too. My focus right now is on protecting the people who matter to me and seeing this investigation through to the end. The truth will come out. The questions continued, but Nathaniel answered each one with composure. He refused to give them any sound bites that could be twisted against him. When he finally stepped back, the flashes of cameras still followed him, but this time he felt in control. Inside the clinic, Nathaniel leaned against the wall just outside Margaret's room, exhaling slowly. His hands trembled slightly from the adrenaline, but he felt a surge of relief. He had done what he came to do. Now it was a matter of waiting for the storm to pass. The door opened, and Margaret peeked her head out. How did it go? Nathaniel smiled faintly. I said what needed to be said. Margaret stepped outside, her eyes scanning his face for any signs of doubt. You've changed, Nathaniel. You're stronger than you realize. Nathaniel chuckled softly. I've had a lot of reasons to get stronger. Margaret placed a hand on his arm, her gaze soft. We wouldn't have made it this far without you. You've done more than you think, Nathaniel said. Your testimony is what's going to bring them down. Margaret's expression shifted, her eyes clouding with worry. Do you really believe that? I do, Nathaniel said firmly. We're going to win this. Suddenly, the sound of his phone buzzing interrupted the moment. He pulled it out and saw a text from David. I found something. Come to the office as soon as possible. Nathaniel's heart raced. I have to go, he told Margaret. David might have found something important. Margaret nodded. Be careful. Nathaniel bent down and kissed her cheek. I'll be back soon. The drive to David's office felt longer than usual, the tension in Nathaniel's chest growing with each passing minute. When he arrived, he didn't bother with formalities. He walked straight into David's office, where his friend was waiting with a stack of papers spread out on the desk. What did you find? Nathaniel asked, his voice urgent. David handed him a document. A whistleblower inside Stephen and Richard's circle just came forward. They've been funneling money out of the trust fund into offshore accounts for years, long after the fire. Nathaniel's eyes scanned the document, his breath hitching. This is enough to destroy them. It is, David agreed. But we have to move fast. If they find out we have this, they'll try to bury it. Nathaniel nodded, his mind already racing with the next steps. Then we don't give them the chance. We take this to the DA first thing in the morning. David smiled, but there was a hint of caution in his eyes. This is it, Nate. The final piece of the puzzle. Are you ready for what's next? Nathaniel set the paper down and met David's gaze. I've been ready for 20 years. As he left the office, the weight on his shoulders felt lighter. The end was finally in sight. And this time, there was no turning back. His uncles had taken everything from him once, but they wouldn't get the chance to do it again. The fire they had started all those years ago had consumed his family, but now, Nathaniel was ready to stand in the flames and make sure they burned for what they'd done. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a pale orange glow across the skyline as Nathaniel drove through the quiet streets of Manhattan. The weight of the document David had given him felt heavier than the paper it was printed on. It was the proof he had spent years searching for, the final key to unraveling the web of lies that had destroyed his family. He parked in front of the DA's office and took a moment to collect himself, gripping the steering wheel tightly as he breathed through the storm of emotions swirling inside him. His uncles had manipulated the system for decades, but now the walls were closing in on them. They wouldn't escape this time. As he stepped out of the car and walked toward the building, the cool morning air helped ground him. Inside, David was already waiting in the lobby, a cup of coffee in hand, and a determined look on his face. "You ready for this?" David asked, handing Nathaniel a second cup of coffee. Nathaniel nodded, taking a sip. "I've never been more ready." They made their way through the security checkpoint and up to the DA's office, where an assistant ushered them into a conference room. The district attorney, a woman in her early 50s with sharp eyes and an air of authority, greeted them with a firm handshake. "Mr. West, Mr. Hawthorne, thank you for coming in so early," she said, motioning for them to sit. "David mentioned you had something urgent." Nathaniel set the folder on the table and slid it toward her. "We've uncovered evidence that Stephen and Richard West have been embezzling money from the family trust for years. Offshore accounts, shell companies, falsified records, it's all in there." The DA opened the folder and began flipping through the pages, her brow furrowing as she read. "This is substantial," she said after a few minutes. "If everything checks out, this could be enough to secure indictments for fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy." Nathaniel's heart pounded. "What about the arson charges?" "We're still working on that," the DA replied. "Henry Ross's testimony is critical, but we'll need more corroborating evidence to make the case airtight." David leaned forward. "What about the whistleblower? Can we use their testimony to back up Henry's statement?" The DA hesitated, tapping her pen against the table. "That depends on the whistleblower's credibility. Do we know who they are?" David pulled out another sheet of paper and handed it to her. "Yes, his name is Patrick Mason. He worked as an accountant for Stephen and Richard's investment firm for over a decade. He claims he handled the financial transfers directly and witnessed them discussing ways to hide the funds." The DA's eyes narrowed as she scanned the document. "Has he agreed to testify?" "We're meeting with him later today to finalize his statement," David said. Nathaniel's fingers tapped against the table, his mind racing. "If we get his testimony on record, how soon can we move forward?" The DA closed the folder and folded her hands on the table. "If Mason's statement holds up, we could issue arrest warrants within the next week. But I'm warning you, Nathaniel, your uncles won't go down without a fight. They'll try to discredit every witness we have, and they won't hesitate to play dirty." Nathaniel met her gaze, his determination unwavering. "Let them try. I'm not backing down." The DA nodded, a hint of respect in her eyes. "I'll get my team working on this immediately. Keep me updated on the meeting with Mason." As they left the office, Nathaniel's mind was already focused on the next step, They were closer than ever to bringing Stephen and Richard to justice, but the battle was far from over. That afternoon, Nathaniel and David met Patrick Mason in a small cafe tucked away on a quiet street. The man sitting across from them was in his late 40s, with thinning hair and a nervous energy that made him fidget with the handle of his coffee cup. "Mr. Mason, thank you for meeting us," Nathaniel said, offering a reassuring smile. Mason nodded, but his eyes darted around the cafe as if he expected someone to be watching. "I didn't have much of a choice," he said quietly. "I've been carrying this for years, and I'm tired of looking over my shoulder." David pulled out a recorder and set it on the table. "We need your testimony on record. Everything you know about the embezzlement, the offshore accounts, and any conversations you overheard about the fire." Mason's hands trembled as he reached for his coffee. "I knew they were crooked from the start," he said. "Stephen was the mastermind. Richard followed his lead, but Stephen was the one who came up with the schemes. I handled the transfers, moved the money through shell companies, and made sure the books looked clean." Nathaniel leaned forward. "What about the night of the fire? Did they ever talk about it?" Mason's gaze dropped to the table. "Yes," he whispered. "I heard them arguing about it a few weeks after it happened. They thought everything had gone perfectly, but Stephen was paranoid. He said they had to keep an eye on Margaret Grace because she knew too much. He was worried she'd talk." Nathaniel's heart pounded. "Did they ever say why they started the fire?" Mason nodded. "It was about control. Your mother wasn't just standing in the way of the trust fund. They saw her as a threat to their business. She was planning to report them for mismanaging family assets. They thought the fire would solve everything." Nathaniel's breath hitched, and he clenched his fists under the table. The depth of their betrayal was worse than he had imagined. David leaned back in his chair, exchanging a glance with Nathaniel. "This is exactly what we needed," he said. "With your testimony, we can tie everything together." Mason looked up, his eyes filled with fear. "What happens to me after this? They'll come after me if they find out I talked." Nathaniel placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "We'll protect you. The DA will make sure you're safe." Mason exhaled shakily, nodding. "Okay, I'll do it." That evening, Nathaniel returned to the clinic with a renewed sense of purpose. Margaret was sitting up in bed reading a book, while Evelyn lay beside her, coloring another one of her whimsical drawings. When Nathaniel entered, Evelyn jumped up and ran to him. "Nate, look, I made a garden with flowers for you and Mama." Nathaniel smiled, kneeling down to admire the drawing. "It's beautiful, Princess. You're getting better every day." Margaret watched them with a soft smile, but her expression turned serious when Nathaniel sat down beside her. "Did you meet with the whistleblower?" "Yes," Nathaniel said. "He's agreed to testify. We have everything we need now." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "Does that mean it's almost over?" Nathaniel took her hand and squeezed it gently. "Almost, but we have to stay strong a little longer." Margaret nodded, wiping her tears away. "Thank you, Nathaniel. I don't know what we would have done without you." Nathaniel looked over at Evelyn, who was humming softly as she added more flowers to her drawing. "You've given me more than you realize," he said, "and I'm not going to let anything take that away." As he sat there, holding Margaret's hand, he felt a sense of clarity he hadn't experienced in years. The battle wasn't over yet, but for the first time he knew with absolute certainty that they were going to win. The morning air was crisp as Nathaniel stepped out of his car, the weight of the upcoming day pressing heavily on his shoulders. He adjusted his tie and glanced around the street before making his way into the DA's office. The security guard at the entrance gave him a brief nod of recognition, and Nathaniel returned the gesture as he passed through the metal detector. Inside the building, the air buzzed with tension. Phones rang constantly. Footsteps echoed in the hallways and hushed conversations filled the space. But for Nathaniel, everything felt muted. His focus was singular. Today would be a pivotal moment. David was waiting for him just outside the conference room, a folder tucked under his arm. "Patrick Mason's statement has been finalized," he said without preamble. "The DA's team reviewed everything and they're confident we've got enough to push forward." Nathaniel's heart thumped, but his expression remained composed. What's the next step? David opened the folder and flipped through the pages, pointing to the highlighted sections. They'll present the evidence to a judge this afternoon to secure arrest warrants for Stephen and Richard. Once that happens, the police will execute the arrests. Nathaniel nodded, his jaw tightening. He had waited for this moment for years, but now that it was within reach, a part of him felt strangely hollow. Would bringing his uncles to justice finally bring him the peace he craved? Or was the damage already too deep? You okay? David asked, studying him closely. Nathaniel took a deep breath. I will be once this is over. David placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. We're almost there. Back at the clinic, Margaret was pacing the room while Evelyn played with her stuffed rabbit on the sofa. The tension in the air was palpable, and Margaret couldn't stop glancing at her phone, waiting for news. When Nathaniel walked in, she immediately rushed toward him, her eyes searching his face for any sign of an update. Did they file the warrants? She asked, her voice trembling. They're presenting the case to the judge this afternoon, Nathaniel said, placing his hands on her shoulders. We'll know soon. Margaret exhaled, her shoulders relaxing slightly. I've been praying for this moment for so long, but now that it's here, I'm scared. Nathaniel guided her to the bed and sat down beside her. I know, but we've done everything we can. We have the truth on our side, and we're not alone in this. Margaret wiped a tear from her cheek. You've carried so much of this burden, Nathaniel. I wish I could have helped you sooner. You're helping now, Nathaniel said softly. And that's what matters. Evelyn looked up from her game, her brow furrowed in confusion. Why is Mama crying? Nathaniel smiled gently and walked over to her, kneeling down beside the sofa. She's not sad, Princess. She's just thinking about how strong you are. Evelyn beamed, her face lighting up with pride. I'm strong because Mama and you take care of me. Nathaniel's throat tightened. He reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. We take care of each other, don't we? Yep, Evelyn said, hugging him tightly. The sound of Nathaniel's phone buzzing broke the moment. He pulled it out and saw a message from David. The judge signed off. Warrants issued. The police are moving in now. Nathaniel's heart pounded as he read the words, the finality of it sinking in. This was it. What is it? Margaret asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Nathaniel stood and walked over to her, showing her the message. It's happening. They're being arrested right now. Margaret covered her mouth, her eyes wide with disbelief. Oh my God. Evelyn, sensing the importance of the moment, climbed off the sofa and ran to her mother's side. What's happening, Mama? Margaret pulled her daughter into a hug, tears streaming down her face. We're finally going to be okay, sweetheart. The bad people can't hurt us anymore. Evelyn tilted her head, her innocent gaze locking onto Nathaniel. Does that mean you don't have to fight anymore, Nate? Nathaniel knelt down, his eyes level with hers. It means we won't have to fight alone anymore. We're safe now. Evelyn smiled and wrapped her arms around his neck, squeezing tightly. I'm glad. I don't like it when you're sad. Nathaniel closed his eyes, holding her close as the weight of her words settled over him. She didn't know the full extent of what had happened, or what they had endured to get to this point. But in this moment, her happiness was enough to remind him why he had fought so hard. The news broke that evening, spreading across every major network and news outlet. West brothers arrested in multi-million-dollar fraud and arson case. The headline scrolled across the bottom of TV screens, accompanied by images of Stephen and Richard being led out of their offices in handcuffs. Margaret and Nathaniel watched the coverage in silence, the magnitude of the moment washing over them. For years, their lives had been defined by the shadows of the past, but now those shadows were finally being dragged into the light. I never thought I'd see this day, Margaret whispered, tears streaming down her face. Nathaniel placed an arm around her, pulling her close. We did it, he said softly. We didn't give up. Margaret rested her head on his shoulder, her sobs quieting as she let the reality of their victory sink in. Thank you, Nathaniel, for saving us. Nathaniel stared at the TV, watching as the camera zoomed in on his uncles being loaded into police cars. "You saved me too," he whispered. Evelyn, who had fallen asleep on the sofa, stirred briefly before snuggling deeper into her blanket. Nathaniel smiled, the sight of her peaceful face filling him with a sense of purpose. This wasn't just about justice anymore. It was about building a future, one where Evelyn could grow up free from fear, and where Margaret could finally live without the weight of the past dragging her down. Later that night, after Margaret and Evelyn had fallen asleep, Nathaniel stood by the window, staring out at the city lights. His phone buzzed with another message from David. "Congratulations, Nate. You did it." Nathaniel smiled faintly, typing a quick reply. "We did it." As he set the phone down, he allowed himself to breathe for the first time in what felt like forever. The battle was over, but the journey wasn't. There were still scars to heal, trust to rebuild, and a new life to create. But for the first time in years, Nathaniel didn't feel like he was carrying the burden alone. He had found something he hadn't realized he was searching for: a family, and with them by his side. He knew that whatever came next, they would face it together. The following morning, the world outside the clinic seemed calmer, as if the city itself had taken a deep breath after the chaos of the previous day. The media frenzy had slowed slightly, though reporters still lingered outside, waiting for the next update on the West family scandal. Nathaniel knew their presence wouldn't disappear overnight, but for now, he could focus on the people who mattered most. Evelyn was sitting at the small table in the room, humming as she colored another picture, this time of a family standing in front of a house with a garden. Margaret lay propped up in bed, watching her daughter with a soft smile. Nathaniel stood near the window, his phone in hand, scrolling through the latest headlines. West brothers charged with fraud, embezzlement, and arson. Bail denied pending trial. The words were like music to his ears. Stephen and Richard had been denied the chance to buy their way out. At least for now. They're really gone, aren't they? Margaret's voice broke through his thoughts. Nathaniel turned to face her, slipping his phone into his pocket. For now, the trial's the next big hurdle, but with the evidence we have, they don't stand a chance. Margaret exhaled, the tension in her shoulders easing. "It feels like I can finally breathe again." Nathaniel walked over and sat beside her, taking her hand. "You should. You've been carrying this for far too long." Margaret squeezed his hand, her eyes glistening with tears. "What about you? How do you feel?" Nathaniel hesitated. For years he had dreamed of this moment, seeing his uncles face the consequences of their actions. But now that it had arrived, the overwhelming sense of relief he had expected wasn't there. Instead, there was a strange emptiness, as if he didn't know what to do with himself now that the fight was over. "I don't know," he admitted. "I thought this would fix everything, but it hasn't. I'm still trying to figure out what comes next." Margaret nodded. "Understanding his struggle. You've been fighting for so long. Maybe it's time to stop fighting and start living." Nathaniel glanced at Evelyn, who was carefully coloring a butterfly in the corner of her drawing. Her small, peaceful world was everything he wanted to protect. "Living," he repeated softly. "That sounds nice." Margaret smiled, her gaze tender. "You deserve it, Nathaniel. We both do." Later that afternoon, David arrived at the clinic, his briefcase in hand and a triumphant grin on his face. Nathaniel met him in the hallway, away from Margaret and Evelyn. "How are they holding up?" David asked, nodding toward the room. "They're okay," Nathaniel said. "Margaret's still processing everything, and Evelyn doesn't fully understand what's happening, which might be a blessing." David sighed, leaning against the wall. "You've done a good job keeping her shielded from all this." "I tried," Nathaniel replied. "But kids pick up on more than we give them credit for." David opened his briefcase and handed Nathaniel a folder. "This is everything we need to finalize the legal proceedings. The DA's office is confident we'll secure a conviction on multiple charges. But there's one last thing I wanted to discuss." Nathaniel flipped through the papers, his brow furrowing. "What is it?" "The assets tied to the family trust," David said. "Once the trial concludes, you'll regain control of everything. The money your uncle stole will be recovered, and the trust will be fully restored. Nathaniel closed the folder, a heavy feeling settling over him. The trust fund had been at the center of the fire, the embezzlement and the lies that had destroyed his family. But now it felt like a relic of a life he no longer wanted. "I don't need the money," Nathaniel said quietly. David raised an eyebrow. "You don't have to keep it for yourself. You could use it to help others. Maybe even set up something for Margaret and Evelyn." Nathaniel considered this, the idea sparking something in him. The thought of turning the very thing that had caused so much pain into something good was strangely comforting. "I'll think about it," he said. David clapped him on the shoulder. "Take your time. You've earned that much." As evening fell, Nathaniel returned to Margaret's room, where Evelyn had fallen asleep curled up beside her mother. The soft glow of the bedside lamp bathed the room in warmth, and for a moment, everything felt peaceful. Margaret ran her fingers through Evelyn's hair, her gaze distant. "She's been through so much," she whispered. "She's strong," Nathaniel said, sitting down on the chair next to the bed. "Just like her mom." Margaret smiled faintly. "What happens now, Nathaniel? What do we do once the trial is over?" Nathaniel leaned back in his chair, his gaze thoughtful. "We build a new life, one that isn't defined by what we've lost, but by what we have." Margaret's eyes filled with tears, but this time they were tears of hope. "I want that." "We'll have it," Nathaniel promised. "I'm not going anywhere." Margaret reached for his hand, her fingers intertwining with his. "You've given us so much, Nathaniel. I don't know how we'll ever repay you." Nathaniel shook his head. "You don't have to. You and Evelyn have given me something too, a reason to stop running." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the weight of the past slowly lifting as they allowed themselves to imagine a future free from fear. "I was thinking," Nathaniel said after a moment, "when Margaret is strong enough, maybe we can take Evelyn to see that garden she's always drawing, somewhere quiet, where she can just be a kid for a while." Margaret smiled, her eyes lighting up. "She'd love that." "Then we'll make it happen," Nathaniel said. Evelyn stirred in her sleep, mumbling something before settling back into Margaret's embrace. Nathaniel watched her, his heart swelling with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. For the first time, he wasn't chasing ghosts or running from memories. He was moving forward, one step at a time, with the people who mattered most by his side. And as he sat there, watching over Margaret and Evelyn, Nathaniel realized that maybe, just maybe, he had found what he had been searching for all along. Home. 1+. A week had passed since the arrests, and for the first time in years, Nathaniel woke up without the familiar knot of anxiety tightening his chest. The morning light streamed through the windows of the clinic room, casting soft shadows on the walls. Evelyn was still asleep on the sofa, her small body curled up under a blanket. Margaret, propped up in bed, had her hands folded in her lap as she watched Nathaniel with a calm but curious gaze. "You look different today," she said softly. Nathaniel smiled faintly and ran a hand through his hair. "Different how?" "Less like you're carrying the weight of the world," Margaret replied. "I think you're finally letting go." Nathaniel pulled up a chair and sat beside her bed, his fingers tapping against his knee as he considered her words. "I'm trying," he admitted, "but it's harder than I thought." Margaret reached for his hand, her touch warm and comforting. "You've spent so long fighting. It's okay to take time to figure out what life looks like without that fight." Nathaniel nodded, appreciating her understanding. "What about you? How are you holding up?" Margaret exhaled, glancing at Evelyn, who was still peacefully asleep. "I feel like I'm waking up from a nightmare that's lasted for years, but I'm scared too. I don't know how to live without looking over my shoulder." "We'll figure it out together," Nathaniel said, his voice steady. "One step at a time." Margaret smiled, her eyes brimming with gratitude. "You've become part of our family, Nathaniel. I hope you know that." Nathaniel's throat tightened, and he squeezed her hand gently. "I do." Later that afternoon, Nathaniel stepped outside the clinic for some fresh air. The city was alive with the usual hustle and bustle. But for the first time in a while, it didn't feel suffocating. He leaned against the railing of the small terrace and breathed in deeply, letting the cool air fill his lungs. His phone buzzed, and when he checked the screen, he saw a message from David. Good news. Stephen and Richard's bail request was denied again. The judge isn't buying their excuses. A wave of relief washed over him, but it was quickly followed by a sense of cautious optimism. The trial was still ahead, and anything could happen. But for now, this small victory was enough. He typed a quick reply. Thanks for the update, let me know if anything changes. As he slipped the phone back into his pocket, the door behind him opened, and Evelyn stepped out, her stuffed rabbit tucked under one arm. There you are, she said, running over to him. Mama said you were outside. Nathaniel knelt down and scooped her up, lifting her into his arms. Did you miss me already? Evelyn giggled. I wanted to show you something. He carried her back inside where she led him to the small table in the room. There, a new drawing awaited him, a garden filled with flowers, butterflies, and a large house in the background. It's our new home, Evelyn said proudly, where we can all live together. Nathaniel's breath caught in his throat. He knelt down beside her, taking in every detail of the picture. It's beautiful, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Is this what you want, Princess? Evelyn nodded eagerly. Yes, I want you and Mama and me to have a place where we can be happy all the time. Nathaniel glanced at Margaret, who was watching them with tears in her eyes. He swallowed hard and turned back to Evelyn. Then we'll make it happen, he said softly. We'll find a place where we can all be happy. Evelyn threw her arms around his neck, hugging him tightly. Promise? I promise, Nathaniel whispered, holding her close. As the evening settled in, Nathaniel sat by the window, watching the city lights twinkle against the darkening sky. Margaret and Evelyn were asleep, their breathing soft and rhythmic, and for the first time in years, Nathaniel felt something close to peace. His phone buzzed once more, and this time, the message was from an unknown number. He hesitated before opening it. But when he did, his breath hitched. The message was short, but it carried the weight of a threat that sent a chill down his spine. You think this is over, but it's not. We're not done with you yet. Nathaniel's pulse quickened, and he immediately called David. Did you see this? Nathaniel asked as soon as David picked up. I did, David said, his voice tense. We're tracing the number, but it's likely coming from someone close to your uncle's. Nathaniel ran a hand through his hair, pacing the room. They're still trying to fight back, even from behind bars. That's what desperate people do, David replied. But don't worry, we've got security watching over Margaret and Evelyn. They're safe. Nathaniel exhaled, trying to calm the storm inside him. I'm not letting them take anything else from me. They won't, David assured him. We're one step ahead this time. After ending the call, Nathaniel stood by the window, his reflection staring back at him. The battle wasn't entirely over, but he wasn't the same man he had been at the beginning of this journey. He had something worth protecting now, and he wasn't going to let fear control him. As he turned back toward the room, he saw Evelyn's drawing on the table. The garden, the flowers, the house that represented everything she dreamed of. Nathaniel smiled softly, his resolve hardening. He wasn't running anymore. Whatever came next, he would face it head-on, with Margaret and Evelyn by his side. And this time, they would win. Together. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation, reporters whispering to one another as they scribbled notes, their pens moving furiously over notebooks. Cameras outside flashed through the windows as Nathaniel walked past the crowd and entered through a side door, escorted by David and a security team. The trial had begun, and today was expected to be a critical day. Patrick Mason's testimony would seal the fate of Stephen and Richard West. Nathaniel adjusted the cuffs of his tailored suit, his expression calm, but his mind racing. This was the moment he had prepared for, the moment his entire life had been leading up to. But beneath his steady exterior, his heart pounded like a drum. David nudged him gently. You okay? Nathaniel nodded. I'm ready. They entered the courtroom, where Stephen and Richard sat at the defense table, their faces carefully neutral but their eyes betraying a flicker of nervousness. Nathaniel met Stephen's gaze, refusing to look away until Stephen finally broke the stare and shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The judge entered, and the room fell silent. As the trial resumed, Nathaniel sat quietly, his fingers resting on the edge of the table as he listened to the prosecution lay out their case. Patrick Mason took the stand, his hands trembling slightly as he was sworn in. Nathaniel leaned forward, his breath shallow as Mason began to speak. "I worked as an accountant for Stephen and Richard West for over 10 years, Mason said, his voice steadier than Nathaniel had expected. During that time, I handled financial transactions that involved moving money from the family trust into offshore accounts. The transactions were disguised to look legitimate. But they weren't. The funds were being stolen." The prosecutor stepped closer, his voice calm but probing. "And did you ever hear conversations between Stephen and Richard about the fire that killed Nathaniel West's parents?" Mason hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "Yes, a few weeks after the fire, I overheard them talking in Stephen's office. They were arguing about how the fire had gone exactly as planned, but Stephen was worried about Margaret Grace. He said she knew too much and that they needed to keep an eye on her." Murmurs rippled through the courtroom as reporters scribbled furiously. Nathaniel's hands curled into fists as he listened, the confirmation of his uncle's role in the fire reigniting the fury he had worked so hard to contain. "Did they ever say why they started the fire?" the prosecutor asked. "Yes," Mason said, his voice growing stronger. "It was to gain control of the family trust. Nathaniel's mother had been planning to report them for financial misconduct, and they saw her as a threat. The fire was their way of eliminating that threat and gaining full access to the trust fund." Nathaniel closed his eyes for a moment, his breath hitching as the weight of Mason's testimony settled over him. His mother hadn't just been a victim of a tragic accident. She had been murdered in cold blood, her life taken for money and power. The defense attorney stood, trying to discredit Mason's testimony by suggesting he was lying to protect himself. But Mason held firm, his voice unwavering as he answered every question with clarity. By the time he stepped down from the stand, the damage to Stephen and Richard's defense was undeniable. Nathaniel leaned over to David. "They can't recover from this, can they?" David smiled faintly. "No, we've got them." That afternoon, the prosecution presented the final pieces of evidence, including Henry Ross's testimony and the financial records that tied everything together. When the judge adjourned for the day, Nathaniel felt a wave of exhaustion wash over him. But it was mixed with relief. They were finally winning. As he stepped outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed him, their microphones shoved in his direction. "Mr. West, how do you feel about today's testimony?" one of them asked. Nathaniel paused, choosing his words carefully. "I'm grateful for the courage of the people who came forward to tell the truth. This trial isn't just about me. It's about justice for my parents and for everyone who was affected by what happened." Another reporter leaned in. "Do you think your uncles will be convicted?" "I have faith in the truth," Nathaniel replied before walking toward his car. David followed closely behind, patting him on the back as they climbed inside. "You handled that well." Nathaniel exhaled, leaning back against the seat. "One more day and this could all be over." David nodded. "And then you can start thinking about what comes next." That evening, Nathaniel returned to the clinic, where Margaret and Evelyn were waiting for him. The room was warm and cozy, the soft glow of the bedside lamp casting a golden hue across the walls. Evelyn ran to him as soon as he entered, throwing her arms around his waist. "How was court?" she asked, her wide eyes filled with curiosity. "It was good, Princess," Nathaniel said, lifting her into his arms. "We're getting closer to making sure the bad guys can't hurt anyone anymore." Evelyn's face lit up. "Does that mean you'll be home with us more?" Nathaniel's heart ached at the innocence of her question. "Yes," he said softly. "I'll be home more." Margaret watched them from her bed, her eyes shimmering with tears. "You've done so much for us, Nathaniel." "You've done just as much for me," Nathaniel replied, setting Evelyn down before sitting beside Margaret. "I wouldn't have gotten through this without you." Margaret reached for his hand, their fingers intertwining. "What happens after the trial?" "We move forward," Nathaniel said. "We build a life that isn't defined by what we've lost, but by what we've found." Margaret smiled through her tears. "I want that." "We'll have it," Nathaniel promised. "We'll find a place where Evelyn can grow up safe, and where you can finally rest without worrying about the past." Evelyn climbed onto the bed, nestling between them as she held her stuffed rabbit close. "Can we have a garden?" Nathaniel chuckled softly. "We'll have the most beautiful garden you've ever seen." Evelyn giggled and hugged her rabbit tighter. "I can't wait." Later that night, as Margaret and Evelyn slept, Nathaniel sat by the window, staring out at the city lights. The weight of the day pressed down on him, but for the first time it didn't feel suffocating. He had faced his uncles, exposed their crimes, and ensured they would pay for what they had done. But more importantly, he had found a new purpose, a family that gave his life meaning beyond revenge. As he leaned back in the chair, his phone buzzed with a message from David. "The prosecution is ready for closing arguments tomorrow. Let's finish this." Nathaniel smiled faintly, typing a reply, "We will." With the trial nearing its conclusion, Nathaniel felt the faintest glimmer of peace. He wasn't sure what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't facing it alone. The courtroom was eerily silent, the air thick with anticipation as the judge entered and took his seat. Nathaniel sat at the plaintiff's table. His gaze locked on the defense side where Stephen and Richard West sat, their expressions tense. Today was the final day of the trial, and by the end of it, a jury would decide their fate. Margaret sat behind Nathaniel in the gallery, her hand resting protectively on Evelyn's shoulder. David sat beside him, flipping through notes, but Nathaniel barely noticed. His focus was on the words he would soon deliver during his final statement. The prosecutor stepped forward to give his closing argument. His words were sharp and methodical, dissecting every lie Stephen and Richard had told, and reminding the jury of the overwhelming evidence. Patrick Mason's testimony, Henry Ross's statement, the financial documents, and the undeniable proof of their motive. "These men," the prosecutor said, pointing directly at the defense table, "orchestrated the deaths of innocent people. They committed fraud, embezzled millions, and destroyed lives, all in the name of greed. Today, you have the power to hold them accountable. Don't let them walk away from this." When it was Nathaniel's turn to speak, he stood slowly, taking a deep breath as he approached the jury. He could feel Margaret's gaze on him, her silent encouragement giving him strength. "I was 7 years old when my parents died," Nathaniel began, his voice steady but thick with emotion. "For years I believed it was an accident. I tried to move on, to build a life where their absence didn't haunt me every day. But the truth was always there, waiting to come to light." He paused, his eyes scanning the jury. "My uncles didn't just steal money, they stole my family. They took away the people who loved me most, and they tried to erase any chance I had at finding peace. But I stand here today because of the people who helped me uncover the truth. People like Margaret Grace and Patrick Mason, who had the courage to speak up." Nathaniel's gaze hardened as he turned toward Stephen and Richard. "You thought you could get away with it. You thought no one would ever hold you accountable. But today, that changes." He faced the jury once more. "This isn't just about justice for me. It's about justice for my parents, for the people who believed in doing what's right, even when it wasn't easy. I ask you to think about that when you deliberate." "Thank you." As Nathaniel returned to his seat, he caught Margaret's eye. She mouthed the words, "You did amazing," and he felt a wave of relief wash over him. The defense gave their closing argument, but their words felt hollow compared to the weight of the evidence against them. When the judge dismissed the jury to deliberate, Nathaniel sat back in his chair, exhaling slowly. "It's out of our hands now," David said, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "I know," Nathaniel replied, his gaze distant, "but I can't help worrying." Margaret and Evelyn joined him during the break, and Evelyn climbed into his lap, resting her head against his chest. "Is it over yet?" she asked sleepily. "Almost, Princess," Nathaniel said softly, stroking her hair. "We're just waiting for the jury to decide." Margaret sat beside him, her hand brushing against his. "No matter what happens, you've done everything you could. Your parents would be proud of you." Nathaniel swallowed the lump in his throat and nodded. "Thank you." 2 hours later, the jury filed back into the courtroom, their expressions unreadable. The judge asked the foreman to stand and deliver the verdict. Nathaniel's heart pounded in his chest as he held Evelyn close, his breath shallow as he waited for the words that would change everything. "We, the jury, find the defendants, Stephen West and Richard West, guilty on all charges." The courtroom erupted in gasps and murmurs, but Nathaniel barely heard them. Relief crashed over him like a tidal wave, his chest heaving as he tried to process the verdict. Margaret reached for his hand, her grip strong and steady. "We did it," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. Nathaniel nodded, his throat too tight to speak. Evelyn, sensing the shift in the room, looked up at him and smiled. "Does this mean the bad guys are going away?" "Yes," Nathaniel managed to say, his voice cracking. "They won't hurt us anymore." The judge banged his gavel, calling for order. But Nathaniel couldn't focus on anything but the overwhelming sense of closure washing over him. The weight he had carried for so long was finally lifting, and for the first time in years, he felt free. That evening, back at the clinic, they gathered around the small table in Margaret's room, sharing a quiet dinner. The air was light, filled with laughter and the sound of Evelyn recounting every detail of the day, as if she had been the one delivering the closing arguments. Nathaniel watched her, his heart swelling with pride and love. Margaret caught his gaze and smiled, as if she could read his thoughts. "Thank you for keeping your promise," she said softly. Nathaniel reached across the table and took her hand. "Thank you for believing in me." Evelyn tugged on his sleeve, her eyes wide with excitement. "Does this mean we can move into our new house soon? The one with the garden?" Nathaniel chuckled, lifting her into his lap. "Yes, Princess. We'll find the perfect place with the biggest garden you've ever seen." Margaret rested her head on his shoulder, her eyes closing as she exhaled a long, contented breath. "We're finally free, aren't we?" Nathaniel kissed the top of her head. "Yes, we are." A few weeks later, they stood in front of a charming house on the outskirts of the city, its white picket fence surrounding a lush garden filled with flowers in bloom. Evelyn ran ahead, her laughter echoing as she explored every corner of the yard. Margaret slipped her hand into Nathaniel's, leaning against him as they watched Evelyn chase butterflies through the garden. "We made it," Margaret said, her voice filled with wonder. Nathaniel smiled, his gaze soft. "We did." As the sun set, casting a warm golden glow over the house, Nathaniel realized that the journey he had taken, the pain, the loss, the fight for justice, had led him here, to a place where he could finally let go of the past and embrace the future. And for the first time in his life, he knew what it felt like to be truly at home.